You know it's this. Take a perk and talk it and see. Money swollen like sis. They done perfected the kid. Got a billion take on my head. I've been better put on the road I just spent. I've been working $1 million. The devil they see they not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the third part of What If Naruto Meets Sekirei. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of ZuttoAragi on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Several moments later, his Sekirei showed up. He looked at them surprised and asked, "Something wrong?" In a nondescript canyon in the land of Earth, two figures stood over a still body. The first was average height with shoulder-length dark gray hair pulled back in a low ponytail. He had onyx black eyes and two diagonal scars under his eyes. He had a leaf headband with a slash through it on his head. The next had light, blue-gray skin, gill-like marks on his cheeks. He had tall, spiky, blue hair styled like a shark fin, small, round, white eyes. He also wore a hidden mist headband with a slash through it that covered his ears and was much taller than other. His most noticeable feature was the massive sword on his back covered in bandages, with a long light brown handle with a skull at the end. Their shared features were full-body black cloaks with red and white clouds and dark purple nail polish. The shorter one spoke first in a flat, cool, emotionless tone. "Kasame, take him." Kasame looked at his partner and grinned, revealing sharp, angular teeth. "Right, Itachi, always giving me the heavy lifting," he said in a sly, confident tone. Itachi just ignored him. Kasame walked over to their unconscious opponent. A tall man wearing red heavy armor that covered the lower half of his face, his torso, arms, and waist. He wore a black gi over his armor and black pants under it. He had a large round hat on his head. He was Han, the Jinchuriki of the five-tailed beast, Kokuo. Kasame placed his sword under Han's body and slung it over his back, and the two left. After a short travel, the duo noticed a messenger owl heading their way. Confused, Kasame stuck out his arm and the owl dove hovered above his arm for a moment, then perched. Kasame dropped Han and his sword to the ground, getting an irritated look from Itachi. After reading the note, Kasame broke into a wide grin. He looked at Itachi and said, "Well, look at that, Itachi. Guess Han's your problem now." Itachi raised an eyebrow at his declaration. Kasame continued, "An old comrade, Zabusa Mamachi, has requested my aid. He's having a real problem and wants some help. Go ahead and tell Leader I'm going to be late." Itachi narrowed his eyes and said, "You know Leader doesn't like us to be late. However, his ire will be yours alone." Kasame grinned, picked up his sword and headed out to the land of waves. Itachi sighed and grabbed Han by the shoulders and tugged. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. Itachi stood up and scratched his head and sighed again. Back in the land of waves, Naruto looked at his Sekirei and asked, "Something wrong?" Musubai stepped forward and spoke first. "We could feel your anger through the bond. Tell us, why are you so angry?" Naruto looked at them in surprise, then dropped into a true smile, a rarity for him. He told them, "Don't worry, I was just thinking about something that made me mad. But I'm fine now." He walked by them with his hands in his pockets and said, "Come on, let's get back before anyone worries." Back at Tezuna's house, Naruto walked in and slinked back from everyone's intense looks. Uncomfortably, he laughed and waved, saying, "Hi." Kakashi sighed and asked, "Something happen?" Naruto shook his and grinned, "Nah, just thought about something that made me mad." "Anyway," Naruto said with a big stretch and yawn, "I'm dead tired from sleeping outside, so I want to rest." He was stopped by a hand grabbing his collar. He turned around and flinched. Kakashi had him by the collar with an eye smile and said, "Nope, you're coming with us." Naruto sighed, "Fine." The group was later at a small clearing with 3 large trees. Kakashi looked at the genin and said, "Anyone guess why we're here?" Sakura was completely confused and Sasuke scrunched his nose in thought, coming up blank. "Tree climbing?" Naruto asked, scratching his cheek. "Come on, moron, don't be so stupid," Sakura chided. getting a flick in the forehead from Homura, who waved his finger in a derisive manner. Sakura pouted. Kakashi I smiled and nodded, then said, "Actually, he's right. But there's one difference, you aren't going to use your hands." Sasuke and Sakura face faulted. Sakura was the first to stand and shouted, "How the hell are we supposed to do that?" Homura flicked her forehead again. Sakura rubbed the increasingly large red mark in annoyance. Sasuke looked at his sensei perplexed. Kakashi looked at Naruto, who was unfazed, and asked, "Am I to assume you know this exercise?" Naruto didn't respond and instead walked forward towards the tree, and proceeded to walk up the tree, to everyone but Kakashi's surprise. Sakura became disheveled and asked, how is he doing that?" Kakashi smiled and giggled perversely. "Well, since Naruto seems to have this exercise down pat, I'll let him tell while I go, train." He then walked away giggling like a mad pervert, leaving a frustrated pair of lightning user, an eyebrow-twitching Naruto, and a confused Sasuke and Sakura. Sighing at his sensei's obvious tactic to go read his smut, Naruto dislodged from the tree and dropped to the ground. He looked at his team and laughed embarrassedly and said while rubbing the back of his head, "Guess that means I'm sensei for a while." Sakura clenched her fists at her side and screamed, "There's not a chance in hell we're calling you Naruto-sensei." Homura, instead flicking her forehead, looked at her sternly, making her remember their conversation last night. In their shared room, Sakura sat cross-legged staring at the ground in shame while Homura leaned against the door in frustration. When Naruto failed to appear that night, she went a tirade about how Kakashi was just letting him do whatever he wants but punishing her and Sasuke for doing similar things and generally just insulted the blonde. She was immediately reprimanded by a very frustrated and very irritated Homura who demanded to speak to her in private. And so she sat, glancing back and forth between the floor and Homura until he spoke. "Sakura," he said, and instantly her head snapped up. "Why do you hate Naruto so much?" Sakura thought for a second and asked, "What kind of a question is that?" Homura sighed and said, "Exactly what I asked. So, why?" Sakura stared up into space for a minute and then shrugged, "Not sure, never really thought about it. I guess it's because he's noisy, hyperactive, and always getting between me and Sasuke or asking me on dates. Well, until he got his Sekirei, that is." "And that's it?" Homura asked, digging deeper. Sakura scratched her cheek. "Well, Mom did always tell me to not play with him and stay away from him when I was little, so I did." "Bingo," he said, pointing at her. "Bingo?" she asked, pointing to herself. "Think about it. During the academy, he fawned over you, doing anything and everything to get your attention, and all he really wanted was you to acknowledge him. Also, did your parents ever say why? Why he was an outcast? Why we was viewed as a monster unworthy of the slightest form of compassion?" he asked, his eyes getting sterner and sterner with every question. Not only seeing his expression, but feeling his emotions through the bond, Sakura was about ready to crumble. Incapable of speech, she just shook her head. "If they told you to jump off a cliff, would you?" Sakura shot back, "Hey, that's not fair. This is totally different." Homura, sighing again, asked, "Do you know why he's acted like such a goofball and an idiot?" Sakura put her finger up and said, "He already told us, to hide his true potential." "Do you know why? And that's not the whole reason either." Sakura just looked at him confused and went, "Huh." Homura rubbed his temples and said, "You may be book smart, but you have the common sense of a rock." "Hey, that's mean," she accused, pointing a finger at him. "You're one to talk," he said flatly. She scrunched back in disbelief. Did he really just say that? I think I'd benefit from shutting up for now. Waiting for her to respond and not getting one, Homura continued. "First, he did that because the council, including your mother, hates him. They see him as a plague on the village and look for every possible moment to either kill him or kick him out." Sakura wouldn't believe that. "That's not possible. My mom doesn't just hate someone like that for no reason." "But she and the rest of civilian council do," he said, maintaining his stern look and starting to regret his reaction to her. Sakura looked down in shame again and asked, "Why?" Homura sighed again and said, "Unfortunately, it's not my place to say. If you want to know, ask Naruto himself." At any rate, like I said, he hid his potential because if the council knew how powerful he was, they would demand his head on a pike. Sekirei was starting to tremble. Must be getting through, a little more, and she should realize, he thought. Then he continued. He also acted so annoying because he has no parents, he never did. They died when the Nine Tails attacked 16 years ago, so he pulled his pranks and acted like a menace so people would acknowledge him. Because it didn't matter if he was loved or hated, as long it validated his existence. You were also the very first person, aside from the Hokage, to show him any form of kindness. So, even after you started avoiding and pushing him away, he still did everything he could to be noticed. In fact, now that I think about it, the only other person, barring his Sekirei, to show him kindness was this mysterious sensei of his. And if what Naruto says is true, he met and trained with this person from when he was 8 until he was 12, and then he just vanished. So, with all that, can you blame him for being so energetic and annoying, and you even attack him at every turn despite he did all of that to get your affection? In fact, Sekirei had, by that point, started crying, realizing how cruel she had been to him and with only her mother, who already hated the blonde, as an example. Homura moved to the door to leave and gave a parting statement. If I were you, I'd try to patch things up. If he doesn't already hate you, that is. Sekirei looked at the door in shock and then proceeded to cry into her pillow. Sekirei finished her reminiscing when Naruto started speaking again. Well, sensei or not, Kakashi told me to help you guys, so I will. Renewed vigor from Homura, she paid great attention to the blonde. This exercise is all about chakra control. You want to condense it in your feet so you can stick to the tree. It's about control because you need to use a specific amount of chakra. Too much, and you will shoot off like a rocket. Too little, and you'll lose your grip. He pulled out 2 kunai, which Sasuke and Sekirei noticed had an appearance, and gave them to the two. Every time you fall off, mark the tree with that kunai, and then try again. Sekirei nodded and began to walk, when Naruto stopped her. You'll probably want a running start at first. She nodded and walked back. Sasuke crouched down and bolted towards the tree, sending chakra to his feet. He took 1 step, then another, and 1 more. That's when the wood cracked and he slashed the tree and got blasted off. Naruto looked at him and said, "That was good, but you used too much. Try a little less next time." Irritated at the blonde acting so superior, Sasuke nodded begrudgingly and did as told. Naruto looked at Sekirei and waved. "You're not gonna climb the tree standing around here." She puffed out her cheeks and ran at the tree, albeit slower than Sasuke. She hit the tree and went twice as far as the raven-haired teen did and slashed the tree. She landed and cheered quietly, then ran back to her starting spot and did it again. They practiced for more than 4 hours, and by that time, Sekirei nearly reached the top, but Sasuke was struggling at the halfway point, and it was angering him. Naruto saw how angry he was and came up with a solution. "Hey Sasuke?" "What?" Sasuke snapped, then looked down and said calmer, "What?" Naruto gave the faintest hint of a smile and said, "I think I know why you're having so much trouble." Sasuke glanced over to him halfway, trying to hide his expectant look. "It's your reserves." Sasuke looked at him completely and raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Sekirei dropped down at the same time and eavesdropped on their conversation, right next to them. They sighed, but Naruto continued anyway. "I mean, your reserves are big. The more chakra you've got, the harder it is to control. I've done a few exercises myself to increase my control that weren't tree climbing. One of them was meditation. I can show you how, and it'll be easier than trying to climb the tree, though you won't be able to move on until can." Sasuke thought for a minute and then nodded. "Great," Naruto chirped and motioned Sasuke to follow. Sekirei joined them, but was stopped by Naruto. "What? You're more advanced at this than Sasuke, so the meditation wouldn't do much for you. Instead, you need to keep practicing until you reach the top. Then I've got something else for you to do." Sekirei nodded a little puzzled and went back to the tree climbing. Kakashi watched all of this from a tree and couldn't surprise the wide-content smile under his mask. He then thought, "He really is just like you, sensei. You would be proud." Sasuke and Naruto walked a little ways and then stopped. Naruto sat down Agura style and motioned Sasuke to do the same, which he did. "Right, put your hands like this," he said. He put his hands close together, palms separated, with the ends of his fingers curled in slightly, but not touching. "Now, imagine your chakra network and try to channel and condense the chakra into a ball in between your hands." Sasuke raised an eyebrow but completed the action, putting his hands next to each other and closing his eyes to envision his chakra network. Naruto activated his chakra senses, an ability given to him by Kurama's chakra, and watched Sasuke's chakra flow from his hands. Naturally enough, it was released from his hands, but most of it just flowed outwards, while a small fraction sat in the middle loosely and lazily swirling around. Naruto frowned at that since it meant despite everyone's boasting how great he was, no one actually bothered to teach Sasuke how to properly mold chakra, simply assuming he was a genius and could do it regardless. So even positive prejudice within the village is a setback. Hopefully I can change them when I become Hokage, Naruto thought. "Hey Sasuke." Sasuke barely made a sound, too deep in meditation to really respond, but responded enough that Naruto knew he heard him. "Your chakra's just going everywhere. You're obviously good with the flow. Now try to condense it into a ball in the middle." Sasuke gave a barely noticeable nod. It took several moments, but the chakra started to flow more evenly. A large amount of it just escaped outwards, but the amount that was being condensed had tripled. Naruto could see a small, shaky sphere forming in the center with more chakra flowing loosely around it. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Sekirei, under the watchful eye of a shadow clone, had just reached the top of the tree and was cheering. Unfortunately, that had a drawback. The thin top of the tree collapsed and she fell off, plummeting to the ground. Sekirei, Homura, and Naruto shouted. The clone began to run, but Homura moved in a blur and slid along the ground and caught Sekirei, slamming into the tree and injuring his leg. Sekirei took a moment to get free of her daze, but when she did, she noticed Homura's pained expression and his hurt leg. She instinctively got off and tried to hold him up. "Homura, are you all right?" she shouted, worried about him. Shoving the pain down, he nodded and said with a weak smirk, "We Sekirei are a bit more durable than you humans." Sekirei gave a relieved smile and then smacked Homura on the head with a scowl. "What if you got hurt real bad?" Homura rubbed his bruised crown and said sheepishly, "I didn't really think that far ahead." Sekirei just sighed as Naruto's clone chuckled. Sekirei and Sasuke's training had been progressing smoothly and surprisingly quickly. Sasuke had finished tree climbing in 2 days and Sekirei in 1. Both struggled with water walking, but Sasuke, much to Naruto's surprise, completed it first. Naruto had then discovered that Sasuke had secretly continued his meditation exercise. Naruto's first instinct was to tease him, but Sasuke's fragile mental state convinced him otherwise. Naruto decided to teach the exercise to Sekirei, but she couldn't concentrate long enough to complete, so they just moved on. The Sekirei had also started training as well. Homura trained with his flame control and decided to help Sasuke perfect his fire-style jutsus, but quickly discovered it wasn't his natural affinity. In response, Kakashi decided to discover what Sasuke's true chakra nature was. "Well, any idea why I pulled you aside today, Sasuke?" Kakashi asked, watching the straight-faced genin. Sasuke looked around a little before shrugging. "Something you want to teach me that Naruto can't?" Kakashi smiled at how much respect Naruto seemed to have gained in his eyes, even if he did keep referring to him as the loser. I smiled and said, "Sort of, or more like I'm better suited." Sasuke raised an eyebrow but kept silent. Kakashi pulled out a small square of rough yellowish paper. Sasuke pointed at it and opened his mouth to ask a question, but Kakashi beat him to it. "It's chakra paper," he said plainly. Sasuke just continued to stare with a puzzled look. Kakashi sighed and whined. "Didn't they teach you anything?" "I thought that's what you were for," Sasuke deadpanned. Kakashi's visible eyebrow twitched. "The only thing I don't like is Naruto's sense of humor. It seems to have rubbed off on Sasuke a little. He's now proud and irritating. What a great combination. I may be imprisoned before we're done here," he thought with irritation. Instead of voicing his thoughts, he just sighed and said, "It's a special kind of paper that reacts to chakra. It responds differently to the different chakra natures. Fire nature causes it to burn, wind slices it, lightning crumples it, earth turns it to dust, and water soaks it. He finished by channeling some chakra into it, causing the paper to crinkle up. Sasuke nodded and took a piece from Kakashi and channeled chakra into it. He raised an eyebrow when it curled into ball. Kakashi was surprised. It seems you have lightning nature chakra, and a strong chakra nature at that. Sasuke was surprised. He never knew he had an affinity for lightning. Maybe now he could get a leg up on Itachi. That thought filled his mind. He broke out into a smirk and nodded to Kakashi. Said Scarecrow narrowed his visible eye and thought, that can't be good. Sekirei was lying on the ground covered in dirt and scuff marks, a rarity for a fangirl. She was huffing and panting. Steeling herself, she stood up on shaky legs and faced her opponent, Homura. One of the things she had decided after Homura's lecture was that she couldn't remain as she was, a weak dependent fangirl, since she would simply hold both Naruto and Sasuke back. To that end, she started training with Homura to increase her hand-to-hand combat skills. She sucked, period. Homura was one step shy of appalled at how weak she was. The problem wasn't her talent or her skills, those were top-notch. The problem was her strength. Due to years of dieting to keep her thin figure, Sekirei's body had almost no muscle mass, and it showed. She knew all the right spots to hit, the way to use the attacks, but there wasn't any force behind the hits. Homura sighed and scratched his head in thought. Sekirei, this isn't going to work. Sekirei shook her head. It has to. I have to get better. Homura sighed again. Your skill is fine, but you're too weak. That line hit her like an Akamichi's human boulder. Am I really that weak? Seeing the pained expression on her face and feeling her emotions through the bond, Homura grumbled and went over to comfort her. You might be weak now, but some physical training and you'll be fine. Really? She asked, reserved but hopeful. Seeing the feeling in her eyes, Homura slinked back a little with a blush. He scratched his cheek and looked away. Yeah, but I'm not the one that can do it. Naruto would be better at that. Something seemed to click in her mind when he said that. Where has he been anyway? Every day he shows up for an hour or two, does some basic lecturing, and then vanishes for hours on end, she asked, completely confused. Homura shrugged. Don't know, he said plainly. He then motioned to Tezuna's house. At any rate, let's head back. There are a few more training-related topics I want to discuss there. She nodded and followed close behind. Naruto was sitting in the same field of flowers, which was now devoid of them, holding a scroll in his hand. Some movement off to the side alerted him. His first instinct was to get defensive, but when he saw who it was he eased up, gave a soft smile followed by a big grin, and then waved to the approaching figure. Hey, Taki. Almost every day since their first meeting 4 days ago, they met at that field, Naruto giving her some preserved herbs to bring to Zabuza each time. His happiness was cut short when he noticed her pained expression. He walked slowly over to her and put a hand on her cheek, causing a noticeable flinch. He pulled her face up and a little smiled at her. What's wrong, Taki? He asked, honestly worried. She placed a hand on his and smiled contently, then said quietly, I wish we could stay like this forever. But we've got a problem, several actually. She removed his hand and looked at him sadly with her eyes watering. Naruto suppressed his irritation and pushed it to the back of his mind and asked, What? She motioned to a spot to sit and he nodded. They sat down as Naruto unsealed a picnic set, complete with a blanket, a basket, and a makeshift cooler made with a scroll. He sat down next to Taki and she wrapped her arms around him. The area had been covered by a light mist, a phenomenon that had started happening during their second visit and occurred randomly at first. Eventually, during their third meeting, the mist was constant and got thicker over time. Taki looked down sadly and started. First, Zabuza's healing much faster than I expected. By the end of the week, he should be fit for combat. Naruto didn't speak and just let her keep talking. Also, he started growing suspicious. It's been much harder to control my mist lately, even back at the hideout. He tried to get me to talk, but I just told him it was exhaustion. She sighed sadly and continued, I'm not sure he believed me, and to make matters worse, your last battle scared him. Naruto raised an eyebrow in confusion. Isn't that a good thing? She shook her head. Not with Zabuza. He gets paranoid when he's scared. He called in for support from another of the 7 swordsmen. A man named Kisame Hashigaki. Naruto looked up in confusion and reached into his pocket. He pulled a small black book and thumbed through the watched him in bewilderment. After a few minutes he stopped and turned the book towards her. It was a bingo book. He pointed to a profile in the book and asked, "Is this him?" Taki nodded solemnly. "Let's see. Name, Kisame Hashigaki, a rogue member of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Hidden Mist. Wields shark skin, a large blade that devours chakra. Rank S. Bounty, 40 million ryo. Sounds pretty nasty." Taki nodded. "He is. I remember one previous mission where Zabuza asked for his help. Kisame is even more of a monster than Zabuza. They don't call him the monster of the Hidden Mist for nothing. Zabuza doesn't care about killing, he just sees it as part of the job. But Kisame loves it. He often takes missions without pay if he does enough killing." Naruto was disgusted. "If you ask me, all these ninja swordsmen are psychotic brutes." Taki chuckled mirthlessly at that. "Yeah, you're probably right." She then looked at Naruto with great concern. "But that's why I'm so scared. Fighting Zabuza would be hard enough. I'm not sure you could take them both on." She looked into his blue eyes and noticed something that astonished her. They weren't filled with fear or even apprehension. All she saw was determination and concern. Her cheeks flushed slowly, her breathing quickened, and her heart rate skyrocketed. The mark on her back felt like a hot iron. She couldn't take it anymore. She wrapped her arms around Naruto's neck and claimed his lips for her own, ravishing him with a deep kiss filled with love, ecstasy, and terror. He could taste her lips on his. Cold, like a kitsu's, but they tasted like the air on a cold morning. It was soothing with a minty undertone. The mark on her back exploded with light and multiple pale, smoky wings came from her back. They flexed outward and seemed to ethereally pass through everything they touched. They separated with a string of saliva between them. Naruto's face erupted in a deep blush, steam poured out of his ears, and then he fainted. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," Taki freaked out nervously and wildly shaking him trying to wake him up. He just flopped around lifelessly. At Tazuna's house, all of Naruto's Sekirei froze at once. They could feel it. A new bond had just formed. Naruto had a new Sekirei. They had varying reactions. Musabai was overjoyed. Another Sekirei had just found who she believed to be the best Ashikabi in the world. Akitsu didn't really care, as long as she wasn't pushed away from Naruto. Yuzume was irked. "How many is he gonna get?" she shouted jealously in her mind. Naruto found himself somewhere dark, with water dripping on his face. He finally stirred to consciousness at the sound of dull tapping. He sat up and opened his eyes to find himself in a familiar place, the large mausoleum that holds Kurama's cage, but it was different. He looked around and saw something he hadn't noticed before. On the ceiling, starting from a large coil in the middle, several pipes filled with yellow chakra went out and into the rest of his mind. He was about to follow and investigate when Kurama got his attention. "Naruto." Naruto turned around and responded, "What?" "It's been rather noisy in here lately," Kurama said with annoyance. Naruto looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" Kurama pointed lazily to the new pipes on the ceiling. "Those are the bonds you're forming with those Sekirei," he said with air quotes. Naruto wondered why he used air quotes but decided it could wait. "Okay, why does that make it noisy?" "Because their minds are connected to yours from those bonds, allowing their thoughts to flow in here with few limitations. They're a rather noisy bunch. Since I'm part of your mind thanks to the seal, I can tune out your thoughts." "But not theirs," he said with growing irritation. Naruto raised an eyebrow. "I don't hear anything." "That's because this is your mind. The bond filters it so you only get their emotions. I'm connected to it but immutably separate. Therefore, I don't have the same blockers that prevent you from hearing their thoughts." Naruto scrunched his nose in thought and then scratched his head wildly. "Ugh, I don't know what that means, but I'm guessing basically I can't hear their thoughts because it's my mind, but you can because you're separate or something. Is that why you called me here?" Kurama looked at him slightly puzzled. "I didn't. You came here yourself after you winged that new Sekirei." Naruto put his hand on his chin and thought out loud. "New Sekirei," his eyes snapped open. "Taki, Kurama, I need to get out of here." He said that and quickly vanished from his mindscape. Kurama frowned after he left. He awoke in the real world to see Taki looking down on him. The sight made him chuckle. Taki quirked an eyebrow and asked, "What's so funny?" He smiled and said, "Déjà vu." She giggled slightly and said, "Yeah, guess so." After that, she frowned. Sitting up, Naruto asked her, "So I guess that means I'm your Ashikabi now, huh?" She nodded silently with a downcast look. Naruto smiled and put a hand on her cheek and said, "Look, it'll be fine. I'm a lot stronger than I look." She looked at him worried and said, "Maybe, but even if you can beat Zabuza, you can't defeat both him and Kasami." He laughed quietly and said, "You forget, I'm not soloing this. I've got all of my friends," he said with his fist clenched assuredly and a fire in his eyes. His confidence made Taki smile. "I guess. Look, I have to get back to Zabuza. His attack is planned for the day after Kasami gets here, which should be in 3 days. I'll see how long I can stall him." Naruto stood quickly and spoke in a hurried tone. "No, Taki, you can't do that. He'll kill you." Taki shook her head. "No, he won't. I just found you, and you have yet to ravish this body of mine, so I can't die yet," she said seductively. Naruto could only stare blankly as blood ran down his nose. Taki laughed and pointed at him. "Naruto, your nose is bleeding." He blinked several times and touched his nose. Then he quickly wiped it off on his sleeve. Taki laughed again, this time more fully. Naruto, seeing her laughing and feeling her joy through the bond, couldn't stop himself from laughing as well. The two stood there for several minutes, just laughing. Not because of some hilarious joke or funny occurrence, but because it was all they could do at the time. Kasame was about 2 days away from the Land of Fire's port. He was walking down a dirt road when he noticed 2 presences nearby. He grabbed the hilt of shark skin and got in a defensive stance, noticing that one of them was not only powerful, but smelled of blood, and lots of it. Soon, 2 people came out from around the corner. The first one was shorter than the other. She wore a kimono top with skin-tight shorts, a red obi around her waist tied in the front and off to the side. She had waist-length pink hair tied in a side ponytail with eyes that were a shade darker. She also wore red combat gloves and tall red boots. She had the countenance of a bubbly teenager, but the stance of a seasoned fighter. It was the other one that concerned Kasame and made Shark Skin tremble with excitement. She wore a tight, short, black leather dress that extended to the middle of her thighs. She had a gray haori with the Sekirei crest on it, long black leather boots, a loosely tied leather belt, and a sword in one hand. She had long light gray hair tied in a ponytail and narrow gray eyes. What Kasami noticed most of all was the bloodthirsty smirk she wore, very similar to his own. The gray-haired woman noticed him first and looked him over. Seeing his cloak, she said, "You must be Kasame." She spoke with a confident and easy-going but barely contained sadistic tone. Kasama narrowed his eyes and asked, "You're my backup, I'm guessing." The gray-haired woman smiled and said, "Yes, I'm No. 04 Karasuba, and this is No. 105 Benitsubasa." Benitsubasa looked at Karasuba annoyed and said, "I can introduce myself, thank you." Karasuba smiled sweetly and said, "It's customary for the leader to introduce her subordinates." Benitsubasa shrunk back with a little fear and just, "All right, hey. She sighed when it seemed her leader's smile had vanished. Kisame looked a little confused but ignored it. "If you're finished, we need to get going." Karasuba just nodded and the 3 continued walking. Taki had just gotten back to the hideout and opened the door to enter. When she did, she was greeted by a heeled Zabuza grabbing her by the throat and shoving her against the wall, then pinning her there with the executioner blade's shoulder rest. Zabuza glared angrily at her but didn't say a word. Taki trembled and looked at him with fear in her eyes. Zabuza narrowed his eyes and said, "I know where you've been, Taki." Taki immediately froze like a statue and lost the ability to speak. Zabuza then continued speaking. "I was smart to have Haku follow you." Taki glared hatefully at the ice woman and clenched her fists. "I won't stop you," he said simply. Taki looked at him in surprise as he removed his sword. "What?" was all she could squeak out. Putting the blade on his back, he said calmly, "I won't stop you from meeting with him, but I'll kill you if you try to hinder us during our battle on the bridge." His expression told her he meant it. Taki started crying slowly and nodded weakly before dropping to the floor and sobbing. I will also kill that boy personally, Zabuza said. She looked at him with terror and grabbed his pants leg and screamed, "No, you can't." Zabuza kicked her off and said, "I don't appreciate it when people take things from me. Depending on how useful you prove yourself to be during our battle, I may let you live." He looked back at her with disinterested eyes before he and Haku left to prepare for Kasame's arrival. Taki curled up and started crying, calling out Naruto's name softly. Naruto was sitting in his room seething. He could feel it. He could feel Taki's utter despair through the bond, and he was pissed. His hands were starting to bleed, only to be healed by Kurama's chakra. What made him even angrier was that he knew there wasn't a damn thing he could do. Wait, he thought. He just had an idea. To confirm it, he calmed himself and went downstairs to talk to Yusun. "Huh, can we feel you through the bond?" she asked in response to his question. Naruto nodded. "Yes. I was wondering if you guys can feel my emotions through the bond like I do yours, and if they have an effect on you." Yuzuma put a finger to her chin and thought for a moment, then nodded and said, "I think. Why?" Naruto responded succinctly, "I can't tell you yet, but I appreciate the information." With that, he decided to head back to his room. Kakashi and the others watched him leave. Sekirei was the first to speak up. "Don't you think he's been acting weird lately?" Kakashi and the others nodded in agreement. "He's also been disappearing a lot lately. Unfortunately, his tracking skills are too good to track him unnoticed," Kakashi said, trying to figure out what the blonde's been doing. "Why don't we just ask him?" Sekirei added. "Please, Naruto wouldn't just spill his guts like that. We're his Sekirei, and even we don't know what he's been doing," Yuzum responded. Akitsu and Musabai nodded silently behind her. Everyone sighed in defeat. In his room, Naruto sat down and started to meditate, trying to bring up as much calming emotions as he could. He spent several moments sitting completely still when he noticed something strange. He started feeling different but disregarded it in favor of contacting Kurama. "Hey, Kurama." "What?" he asked, annoyed that the blonde kept interrupting his sleep. "Do you ever do anything but sleep?" Naruto asked. "I spend every single day locked in a cage not much bigger than myself. And that is inside a sewer so small my head would barely fit," he said flatly. "Good point," he responded, embarrassed. "So, what do you want?" he asked calmly. "Right, I was wondering, can you transfer some of my emotions directly to the different bonds?" "That's a bizarre request, even for you," the Biju said with a confused tone. "Right, I know, can you do it is the question," he said, growing impatient. Yes. I suppose you want me to transfer those soothing emotions to your newest Sekirei." Naruto gave a mental nod. Closing its eyes in concentration, Kurama started directing the emotions through Taki's bond. In Zabuza's hideout, Taki still lay on the floor, her eyes still watering slowly. Suddenly, she felt something wash over her. It felt like an all-encompassing, soothing warmth that wrapped itself around her in a protective enclosure. A small smile formed on her face as the feeling washed over her. She knew it came from Naruto. She didn't care how, she just knew that he was doing it. A smile tugged at Naruto's face as he could sense Taki's emotions starting to even out. It seems his last-ditch effort paid off. After a few minutes, when he could sense that she had calmed down completely, he cut the connection and decided to go back to training. He was stopped, however, when he opened the door. Standing in front of him in the hallway was Inari. The boy said nothing and just started walking. Confused, Naruto decided to follow. Naruto followed the boy outside and found him sitting on the edge of the patio with a depressed look. Naruto sighed and cursed his caring nature as he joined the boy. Inari just glanced at him and didn't say anything. This silence continued for several uncomfortable minutes. Despite being much more mature and level-headed than when he was little, Naruto still didn't like the silence. So he decided to break the ice. "Hey Inari, aren't these stars amazing?" he asked. "What kind of a question is that?" Inari deadpanned. Naruto laughed uncomfortably and said, "All right, not much of a stargazer, I see. So, what do you like to do?" Inari simply shook his head and said, "I don't know." Naruto gave an exaggeratedly surprised look. "Egad, a kid like you has to have something you like to do," he said as he flicked the boy in the forehead playfully. Inari rubbed his forehead and said with a pout, "What was that for?" Naruto shrugged. "Just something my sensei used to do whenever I was down. Whenever I was depressed because the villagers assaulted me or I just had an all-around crappy day, he'd make some random out-of-the-blue statement and then flick my forehead. It usually caught me by surprise and made me mad," Naruto reminisced with his eyes glazed over in nostalgia. "But it always made me smile. He was the first person besides the old man or the ramen stand owners to acknowledge me as a person." He finished with an honest smile. Inari's face was messed in confusion. "What do you mean when the villagers assaulted you?" he asked. Naruto laughed mirthlessly and said, "I'm not real popular back in my home village. Most of the people there hate me and despise me for something I can't control. My sensei taught me that they aren't actually evil people. They're just scared and don't know any better." Inari looked down in self-pity. He then said, "Hey, Naruto." "HM," he said mindlessly. "Sorry," with heaviness in his words. Naruto looked away from his stargazing and blinked a couple times. He then asked, "What for?" Inari looked at him in a mixture of annoyance and pleading. For saying those things before." Naruto cocked an eyebrow, but then straightened in recognition. He waved Inari's apology away and said, "Ah, don't worry about it, kid." Inari looked at him in disbelief. "How can you say that?" Naruto gave him a toothy grin. "I'm the one that should be apologizing. I snapped at you like that. You didn't say those things out of scorn or anger. You're just scared." Inari was in disbelief. Seeing that, Naruto continued. "Your mom told me. About Kaiser, that is." Inari looked down and said, "Oh." "She told me how he just showed up one day and started treating you like a son. About how he was the town's hero for swimming through the river's raging current to seal the dam," he said, recounting the events Tsunami had told him. Inari had tears licking at his eyes. "She also told me how much he meant to you, especially after your real father left. She also told me about how he died," he said sadly. Inari was crying soundlessly next to Naruto. "She told me how he died standing up to Gato and his thugs, not going back on his beliefs until the bitter end," Naruto continued proudly. Inari's crying halted when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Naruto with a kind, almost fatherly smile. "You see, Inari, most people talk about heroes being super powerful like the first Hokage or the Sage of the Six Paths. They were powerful, yes." Naruto gazed back at the stars with a distant expression. "But that's not what made them heroes. What made them heroes was their unwavering conviction to their beliefs. The fact that they stood up for what they believed in and were prepared to sacrifice everything for what was right. That's what makes someone a real hero is. Someone who is ready to give up their lives or their honor in pursuit of what they think is right." Inari smiled through his tears and started crying into the blonde shirt. Naruto just rubbed his back gently. Kakashi watched from around the corner and couldn't suppress the errant tear that escaped from his eye. "Minato-sensei, you really would be so proud of him." Within the Hidden Leaf village, Asuma Sartobi was sitting on a bench in the village, smoking a cigarette and drinking some sake. He wasn't normally depressed, but he sure was today. First, he's had a crush on his fellow Jonin Kurenai Yuhai for months. He believed it was secret, but anyone with two eyes and a chunk of meat between them could see it clear as day. He had tried asking her out several times and had been denied every time. He had tried again today, but was shot down rather rudely. He didn't know why, but she seemed to have a general distaste for men. That had got him good. But that wasn't all. His team had just completed their 30th D-rank mission, a landmark for fresh genin teams, especially considering the team has only been active for 2 weeks. He had tried to brag to the Hokage, his father, but he had been reprimanded just like every other sensei bragging about his students. For some reason, Asuma always hoped his father would treat him like a son, the same way he did Naruto. He gripped his bottle firmer at that thought. He didn't hate the kid like everyone else did, but he didn't like him either. That was mainly because his father treated the kid more like a son than he did Asuma himself. He tried to not let it get to him, but Asuma couldn't help the bitterness that formed at his father. Even when Asuma was given one of the greatest honors a shinobi can get, to join the Guardian Shinobi 12, his father treated him like he would any other shinobi. Asuma knew why he did it. He was the Hokage. He couldn't play favorites, not even with his own son. but damn did it piss him off. He had spent the majority of the night sitting on a secluded bench watching the stars and drinking and smoking. With a sigh, he decided to get up and leave when someone spoke up behind him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Asuma turned around and nearly choked on his own tongue. Sitting there on one of the park's walls, holding a sake bottle in one hand and a sake dish in the other, was a woman unlike anything he'd ever seen. He wasn't sure if it was the sake or she actually looked that gorgeous, but he couldn't take his eyes off of her. Henna, wearing a short purple Eastern dress which exposed her cleavage and abdomen with a crisscross pattern across the middle. She looked over to Asuma and smiled. She then said solemnly, "Just sitting out here, drinking and watching the stars pass by helps calm my nerves. How about you?" He nodded with a small smile and said, "Yeah, it does." Asuma Soratobai. She looked at him and said, "That's a good strong name. Mine's Henna." Asuma chuckled and said, "Sure fits." She laughed at his comment and shook the bottle she had and asked, "Wanna share?" He motioned to the spot next to him and she moved to sit down and poured him a drink. They sat there drinking in silence for what felt like hours, just watching the moon pass overhead. Eventually Asuma yawned and said, "Well, I'd better get going." Henna smiled and said, "I enjoyed tonight." Asuma nodded and said, "Me too. See you around sometime?" he asked. She nodded and said, "Definitely." He waved behind him as he walked away. Henna looked up at the night sky and said quietly, "Maybe there is hope for this clipped bird after all." She then fell over unconscious on the bench. In the land of waves, Zabuza was in his hideout strengthening his body after the week of inactivity while he recovered. After Taki's recent elopement with the blonde leaf brat, Zabuza decided Haku should tail her whenever she left. Taki and Naruto also only met that last time because Taki had signaled she'd been followed. Naruto wanted to disregard it, but knew he would put the others in danger if he let his emotions get the better of him. Zabuza momentarily stopped his training when the door to the hideout opened. Zabuza frowned when in walked Gazu, the only remaining member of the Akuma brothers. Zabuza hadn't heard about that development and was thus confused when Gazu showed up alone. "Gazu, where's your brother?" Gazu clenched his fist and spat out. "The blonde brat killed him." "Listen, Zabuza," he was cut off by the swordsman. "I know what you're going to ask and the answer is no," he said simply. Gazu became furious. "Why the hell not? The bastard killed my brother. I should be the one to kill him." Zabuza chuckled at him and said, "You're far too weak to beat him. Instead, you'll handle that harem he travels with." Hearing this, Gazu smirked under his mask and cooed, "Perfect." Zabuza raised an eyebrow. Gazu started laughing maniacally. "Perfect. I can do one better than kill the little shit. I can do what he did to me. I'll tear each of those bitches to ribbons." Hearing his subordinate's crazy declarations gave Zabuza a headache. Taki, on the other hand, was furious. Not only was that little worm threatening her ashikabi, he was threatening her sisters. If it weren't for her lack of combat abilities, she'd kill him herself. Instead, she resigned herself to creating a small cloud of mist around his head, effectively blinding him. Gazu stood there flailing and ranting. Taki giggled quietly, but stopped when Zabuza glared at her. She dispelled the mist right before Gazu slammed his head into a wall. Zabuza just sighed and rubbed his temple. Kasame and the others had just arrived in the land of waves and were heading towards the spot Zabuza said was his hideout. Along the way they encountered Gato. He was accompanied by two of his bodyguards, an insane-looking man with short hair and covered in scars, and another lazy-looking man with short blue hair and a beanie. He also had his nephew and two of his Sekirei with him, Toyotama and Ikiya. Toyotama had become distant to Izumi in recent days. They had regular meetings with Zabuza's crew, and she ended up spending time with Taki, who had recently started going on incessantly about her wonderful ashikabi. At first Toyotama thought she was annoying, but she slowly became happy for and then jealous towards the silver-haired woman since she had found something Toyotama didn't even know she wanted, an ashikabi that cared about her. Izumi didn't. To him she was just an asset. He only cared about her as long as she was useful and often told her to keep her cares and concerns to herself. Toyotama didn't like that. She hated it in fact. But Ikiya didn't seem to care. She just liked fighting. She even goaded Zabuza into a fight several times. And even though she lost each time, she usually had an expression of pure ecstasy on her face during the fights. Toyotama was certain she was insane. Toyotama just wished she could leave her Ashikabi and only knew 3 ways for that to happen. Those were for her to lose, him to die, or abandon her. Even though it wasn't done consciously, Toyotama subtly made herself less and less desirable to Izumi. She stopped volunteering for errands he had, and often refused to fight when the opponent was obviously too weak. Izumi found that annoying but knew she was very strong and just didn't want to waste her time. That was the only reason he kept her around at all. At that moment, Izumi spotted Karasuba and Benitsubasa and huffed. He looked at Kasame and asked, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Gato looked equally disgruntled and said, "I was wondering the same thing." Kasame grinned, showing off his shark-like teeth and said, "Zabuza's requested our help, so we're giving it to him." Gato growled, "Well, just make sure to tell that useless sack of shit that I'm not covering the costs to hire you." Kasame scowled and said, "We may not be friends, but I still respect Zabuza, so I suggest you watch yourself. After all, sharks love to eat swine," he said with a psychotic grin. Gato stepped back several feet while sweating profusely. His swordsmen prepared to draw their swords but decided against it when Kasame released some killer intent. The group arrived shortly after and met with Zabuza. Karasuba simply looked out the window distant and thought, "I can feel it. There's somebody here harboring great hatred, and it's making my body heat up." She changed her placid expression to a subtle demonic smirk. Haku noticed this and adorned a worried expression, but ignored it since Zabuza wanted to work with the woman. "So, that's how the battle'll go, eh?" Kasame said with a grin. Zabuza nodded. "Yes, Gazu and Pinky will split the blonde brat's Sekirei up. I will take Kakashi. You will take the fire Sekirei. Karasuba will take the Uchiha brat." Karasuba spoke for the first time since the meeting started. "Uchiha brat? You mean Itachi's little brother?" she asked with a grin. Zabuza narrowed his eyes and nodded slowly. Karasuba licked her lips and said, "So, this intense hatred is coming from him. I can't wait to see where he goes with it." Gazu interrupted and said, "Listen, bitch, that little brat helped kill my brother, so either you kill him or I will." Karasuba glared at him, and in one swift, blurry motion, she sliced his head off his shoulders. It fell to the ground with his body in a spray of blood. Izumi looked at her with a twisted smirk and Gato simply smiled. Gato then said, "Guess that means one less rogue ninja to pay." Zabuza glared at the short man but decided it was too much trouble. He sighed and said, "With that development we need to rearrange the battles. Karasuba, you'll handle the Sekirei and Haku will?" "No," she said sharply. "I will fight Sasuke. You can pick someone else to deal with those pawns." Zabuza sighed and said while scratching his head, "How about Toyotama?" She looked at him and shrugged. "Fine." Zabuza nodded and said, "We've still got some bugs to work out, so let's attack the day after tomorrow." Everyone in the room nodded. In a small clearing in the forest near Tazuna's house, the ground and trees in the area were charred and sparking. Sasuke stood in the middle panting when Kakashi walked out from behind a rock with a sweat drop. "Don't you think you overdid it a little?" he asked to his exhausted student. Sasuke caught his breath and said with a smirk, "No, I think it's just perfect." "Agent," Kakashi drawled out. "How about we join up with the others?" Sasuke nodded. Sakura had just finished a spar with Hamura, who was busy spitting out water. "You've gotten better, you can even put out my fireballs with that jutsu," he said proudly. "Yay!" Sakura jumped into the air happily. Hamura could only smile at her enthusiasm. "Sakura, let's take a break for now." She nodded jovially and followed behind him with a big smile. Naruto's training was giving him trouble. His elemental manipulation seemed to have stalled. He couldn't get any better than it was. He was hoping to be able to control his element freely, but the best he could do was use his wind jutsus without hand signs. His strength training had also hit a wall. He couldn't seem to get any stronger physically. He slammed a tree with his fist and cursed, "Damn, why can't I?" He stopped when a shadow clone dispelled and sent him its memories. "That's it," he snapped his fingers. The clone had been studying sealing jutsu and had discovered the weight seals. With those he could increase the resistance on his body, allowing him to continue his normal training but get stronger anyway. He immediately began practicing the seals until he got them right and then applied them to himself. He channeled some chakra into them and immediately face planted. He moaned and said, "Great, maybe 10 times normal was too much." He then started straining to lift himself up. After about an hour, Naruto had gotten to where he could walk with the seals on, albeit awkwardly and stiffly and with great effort. His clones started dispelling in groups, and when the last one was gone, he deactivated his seals and went back to Tazuna's house. The 3 groups arrived at Tazuna's house at much the same time. Seeing them, Naruto waved and said, "How's training going?" Sakura pulled her hands close and said proudly, "Great! I've already learned 1 water-style jutsu and have even gotten good enough to douse Hamura's flames." Naruto looked at her awkwardly and then to Homoda, who waved his hand to say leave it alone. He nodded subtly and asked Sasuke the same thing. Responding with a smirk, he said, "It's going good, of course. I am an Uchiha after all." Much to Naruto and Kakashi's dismay, Naruto's training seemed to bloat Sasuke's ego rather than deflate it. Though Naruto, through careful conversational maneuvering, had discovered that Sasuke's new inflated ego was actually a coping mechanism for not being as strong as he wanted to. Knowing this, Naruto acted like he didn't know, since bruising the Ravenet's ego too much could have the complete opposite effect his training is supposed to have. Tired from the day's training, or from excessive reading of porn in Kakashi's case, Team 7 and the 5 Sekirei with them had all arrived back at Tazuna's house to sit down to dinner. They were all too tired to be tense about the upcoming battle with Zabuza that was sure to happen before long, and they were getting stronger, their teamwork better. Spirits were starting to run high, despite the anxiety of waiting for combat to come. Tsunami was a great cook, especially considering she didn't have much to work with given the overall state of the land of waves. Before long, Naruto and the others were happily eating dinner, and Naruto found himself musing at just how sumptuous of a meal Tsunami could make, when an abundance of food and other cooking agents would be available. His musings were interrupted as he was brought into the conversation going on at the dinner table. Topics ranged from the kinds of things that Tazuna and family were going to do after Wave was free, to what Inari wanted to be when he grew up, to what Team 7 and the Sekirei would do once they got back to the Leaf. Through it all, he began to detect a vague discomfort just on the edge of his consciousness. As the conversation continued, the uncomfortable sensation grew stronger and stronger, and Naruto could tell that it was not his own. It didn't take him long to identify the emotion he was detecting. It was loneliness. At first he wondered if it was Taki who was lonely, but he could sense the almost misty feeling that came with her emotions. Taki was feeling sharp focus on something. She was probably concentrating on some task that Zabuza told her to perform. He realized that with the loneliness came an almost icy feeling as well, helping him to identify which of his Sekirei was feeling this loneliness bordering on isolation. He looked to his left to regard Akitsu. She was in her normal, outwardly emotionless, and docile state. She wasn't participating in the conversation, but just eating quietly. He could see her eyes flitting this way and that on occasion. It was almost as though she was hoping that someone would remember she was there. The loneliness began to couple itself with discouragement and mild hurt, as though her heart just felt heavy, as if weighed down. Naruto discreetly placed a hand on her knee, causing her eyes to widen slightly before she turned to regard him. With a single glance, he was able to convey to her that he wanted to talk to her alone once dinner was over. With a smile, he nodded to her. Her face flushed at the gesture before she gave him an almost unnoticeable smile of her own before nodding to him in gratitude. Once they had all finished their meal and helped Tsunami to clear the table, Naruto glanced at Akitsu, who caught his gaze. He motioned towards the back door with his head and walked in that direction, prompting her to follow. She followed him outside to the end of the pier that their house led out to and sat down. Then he patted the spot next to him. Akitsu reservedly sat down in the spot indicated. The two spent several minutes in silence, with Naruto glancing at her, and Akitsu simply staring out at the water that was reflecting the light of the moon, causing it to dance and break in ripples and waves. Realizing that Akitsu would not start this particular conversation, Naruto asked, "Akitsu, what's wrong?" Akitsu slowly turned to look at him, then back to the water and said, Ah, nothing. Naruto narrowed his eyes and said, I can tell you're lonely, Akitsu. I can feel it through the bond, and I know loneliness very, very well. Please, talk to me. That comment made her hang her head in sadness. She answered, I haven't had much time with mass air with you since you winged me. Naruto sported a sad smile and said, Yeah, I really am sorry about that. Things have been kinda busy lately. Mind telling me what's bugging you in a little more detail? She looked at him with a small smile and said, You spend so much time with the others, laughing and having fun. She trailed off as her expression saddened as she finished. But I just follow you silently, waiting for orders. Naruto chuckled and said, Yeah, you do that, don't you? He noticed her saddened expression and suddenly felt foolish. He knew better than to make jokes like that, especially considering that Akitsu had severe abandonment issues and was only now learning how to experience life on an even playing field with his other Sekirei. Sometimes she still felt broken, even though she wasn't from a physical standpoint anymore. Naruto vowed to himself that he would be more sensitive to her feelings and situation, unique as they were. He put his hand on her knee just like he had at dinner, bringing her gaze to meet his. Once he had her attention, he apologized with a contrite smile. I'm sorry, Akitsu. That comment was in very poor taste. Please forgive me. Akitsu's eyes went as wide as Naruto had ever seen them, while her mouth went agape. He could feel the shock that Akitsu was emanating through the bond. Had she never been given an apology for anything? Had she never expected to get one from him or anyone else? Naruto continued, I'm guessing that you feel left out, is that it? Her eyes began to water just enough for Naruto to tell that his concern for her touched her. Looking back to the water, she nodded slowly and said, Ah yes, that's what I feel. Naruto scratched his cheek and said, Well, do you want to spend some time with me, laughing and having fun like the other girls do? Still staring at the water, she answered, I desire that, yes. Well, why didn't you just ask me? He asked with patient understanding. She looked at him in confusion. There's that pause again. Must be a tic, he thought, noticing how often she paused during speech. But I am your Sekirei, she said plainly. His head cocked to the side, and he raised an eyebrow and said, And? Since when does that mean you're not allowed to ask me to have fun with you? She looked down again and held her hands to her chest and said, I am your Sekirei. My purpose is to serve you as my Ashikabi. I need only request what is necessary. Naruto felt it again, his ire toward Minaka. He sighed in aggravation, releasing his tension so that Akitsu wouldn't feel as though she was the object of his aggravation. He said to her in a patient, calm manner, You're my Sekirei, yes, but that doesn't mean you're my servant. She looked at him and tilted her head to the side in confusion. Her eyes narrowed into a thoughtful frown. Naruto rubbed the bridge of his nose with his thumb and pointer and said, How do I put this? I guess the bond between a Sekirei and Ashikabi, to me at least, isn't a bond of master and servant. It's so much more than that. It's like a bond of close friends, family, loved ones all rolled into one. But even that doesn't explain it sufficiently. He looked at her hopefully but frowned when she still didn't seem to understand. Sighing, he simplified it by saying, Basically, you're not my servant, you're my friend. You're a loved one, and you're my family. And loved ones, they do things for each other. They give and take. Seeing that she was still trying to grasp what it was he was telling her, Naruto decided to drive the point home by telling her what it meant between the two of them. Akitsu, I want to give just as much to you as you want to give to me. Meaning if there's ever anything you need, or simply want, feel free to tell me, and I'll do my best to give it to you. A look of reserved shock came over her face. She had always been told by her adjuster that a Sekirei's purpose was to serve their Ashikabi's every whim and to do so without question. But right here, right now, her Ashikabi was essentially telling her that was wrong. He was telling her that he would do as much for her as she was willing to do for him. Nervous, Akitsu blushed and asked, Then, could we go and see the town together tomorrow, just the two of us? Naruto thought about it and shrugged with a smile and responded, I'd love to do that with you, Akitsu. I've already made a few trips into town with Tazuna, and there isn't much. But they've got some pretty nice restaurants that Goto hasn't completely pilfered or bled dry. And there are also a few good places to relax. So how about after breakfast tomorrow you and I go into town and have some fun? You want to make a day of it?" She looked at him with a wide smile, wide for her anyway, and nodded with a blush. She then wrapped her arms around his and snuggled close to him. Though to Naruto's dismay, or pleasure, this had the added effect of pressing his arm right between her melons. And because he was wearing a t-shirt and she wore such a revealing kimono, he could feel every bit perfectly. As a result, his face blushed up a storm, and it took every ounce of willpower he had not to rocket off into space with a nosebleed. He was about to make this point known when he looked down and realized Akitsu had fallen asleep. All he could do was smile sweetly and went back to stargazing, and trying to ignore the incredible sensation he was getting from her rhythmic breathing. Though if the tightening of his pants was any indication, it wasn't working. He just sighed and said quietly, "Why me?" The next morning, Akitsu sat next to Naruto with a near unnoticeable smile on her face while they ate breakfast. Everyone prepared to go out training, but Sasuke became confused when instead of wearing training gear, Naruto had donned more casual clothing. He walked up to the blonde and asked, "You skipping training today?" Naruto nodded and said, "Basically. I promised Akitsu I'd take her around the Wave Village today, so I'm going to be busy most of the time." Confused and hoping for a spar, Sasuke grunted in irritation but nodded nonetheless and headed out with the rest. Akitsu walked up to Naruto and he reached for hand and asked, "Ready?" She nodded and took his hand. With that, the two left the house and made their way into town. Naruto led her to the tourist district, the one area of town that Gato left untouched, as he knew that if this district went under, the country would be of no further value to him as everything else would also completely dry up. The first place Naruto brought her was a clothing store, where she spent several hours trying different outfits. She had selected a couple of dresses, as well as some shirt and pants shorts ensembles, all with matching shoes, but she decided to leave the store in a sexy, sleeveless off-white dress with black accents, including a sash around her waist, causing the dress to hug her body above the waist, while flowing freely below it and ending mid-thigh. She wore matching high-heel shoes, also in an off-white color. Naruto couldn't help but stare at her for several minutes before telling her, almost breathlessly, just how beautiful she looked. Naruto also bought himself a few new outfits, and left the store wearing a black button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the middle of his forearms, with khaki slacks, a brown belt, and brown snakeskin loafers. Akitsu blushed rather heavily herself upon seeing how dapper Naruto looked when he cleaned up. Naruto paid for everything, and they left the store hand in hand once more, almost giving off the appearance of a glamour couple. From there, Naruto brought her to a boutique where he had the cosmeticians doll Akitsu up by applying some foundation and blush to her face, a dark pink gloss to her lips, and mascara and eyeshadow to her lashes and eyelids. To say that Akitsu was stunned at the woman she saw staring back at her was an understatement. She almost started to cry. She had never thought of herself as beautiful before, and to see such beauty in her own reflection had been slightly overwhelming for her. Naruto smiled and bought her all of the cosmetics she would need to duplicate the look should she ever wish to do so. They decided to stop for lunch in a small seafood restaurant. Both of them enjoyed their meals, though Akitsu still remained somewhat quiet. She would always speak when spoken to, but initiating conversation was something she either didn't want to do or didn't think to do. Naruto made a note to himself to help her with this as he paid the bill and led her out of the restaurant to continue their date. It was Akitsu who stopped Naruto and brought him into a pet shop that they passed by, and Naruto discovered Akitsu's love of all things small and furry. To his surprise, she had a passion for foxes. Naruto wasn't sure what to think of that, but Kurama made sure to tease him mercilessly about it. After leaving the pet shop, they spent a good 2 hours just strolling along the waterfront boardwalk hand in hand, just perusing the windows of the different booths and shops while talking to each other about random things. Naruto was beginning to succeed in his attempts to get Akitsu to speak on her own initiative, as she would comment on things that caught her eye, often leading into her asking Naruto some basic questions about himself. Naruto smiled at this, as she was the first of his Sekirei that was actually trying to get to know him by talking as opposed to relying solely on the bond. The last place the two of them actually stepped into was a small novelty store on the west end of the tourist district. The store sold random objects ranging from strawberry-shaped shinobi pouches to specialized perfume bottles that were shaped like famous landmarks. Akitsu was thoroughly enjoying herself looking at all of the rare oddities. She made a point of mentioning to Naruto everything that caught her eye, with far more enthusiasm than Naruto could ever recall seeing from her, though only those who knew her would be able to tell. Naruto couldn't help but find this endearing and simply went with it as she perused the shop. As they browsed the store's wares, one item seemed to catch her eye above all the others. It was an old set of earrings shaped like snowflakes that had the Uzumaki swirl in the middle. Akitsu simply ogled the items in wonder. "Wow," Naruto said breathlessly, mainly in response to Akitsu but surprised himself. These old earrings are actually a testament to an old alliance the land of snow and the land of whirlpools had nearly 40 years ago. "Do you like them?" She turned to him, smiled, and nodded. "Rather quickly," Naruto observed. Naruto then grabbed them and said, "Then they're yours." They left the store with Akitsu holding her newly purchased earrings and smiling contentedly at them. The two of them eventually made their way to a park and Naruto set up a picnic area. He looked at Akitsu with a smile but then frowned when he noticed she still didn't have the earrings on. "Don't you want to wear them?" he asked, wondering if she only bought them because he seemed to like them. She nodded and said, "Ah yes, I just don't have a mirror to use to put them on with." He chuckled, his concerns sent away, and said, "All right, here, let me." She handed the earrings to him and held her hair away from her ear on her right side. Naruto gently pushed the earring into the pierced hole and attached the lock to hold the earring in place. They repeated the procedure with Akitsu's left ear. Naruto nodded in satisfaction at his work when he was done. When he looked back to her face, his breath caught in his throat. Her face had a light dusting of pink that blared like sirens on her pale skin, and her eyes were half-lidded, but not in her normal bored expression. He gulped at the way she caught the light of the setting sun as it seemed to surround her, giving her a fiery orange luminescent glow. "You," Naruto began as he blinked, unable to make his tongue shape the words in his mind. "Yes," Akitsu gently prompted, leaning forward as her eyes opened just a little bit. "You look heavenly," he breathed out at last, finally regaining full control over his power of speech. Akitsu, to Naruto's surprise, smiled wide at his compliment. Her eyes began to water. Through the bond, she could feel his amazement at how she appeared to him at that moment. She could feel his love for her, that special love that was so much like his love for his other Sekirei, but so different as well. She knew that it was her place within his heart, the place that belonged to her alone and would never be supplanted by another. At last, her eyes shed their tears as she asked, "Why do you love me so much?" "Because I know you," Naruto gently answered her as he brought his fingers to her face. "I know your pain, your desire to be loved purely and without condition. I know you so well because your pain is my pain, your desire is my desire." He began to slide his fingers forward against her cheek, bringing his hand to rest upon it as she closed her eyes and leaned into it, placing her hand over his as she held it to her face. "And most importantly, your joy is my joy." They unconsciously came closer together as their faces drifted towards each other. Naruto closed his eyes as he drew closer to the beautiful Sekirei's face. Their lips were about to touch, and he could feel the heat rising through his body like a flame. Akitsu felt her body growing hotter as well. Their lips caressed each other gently, and then locked together. This kiss was different than the chaste kisses they had shared up to now. They both knew it would be. Both of their reservations and hesitations about giving themselves to each other now gone, Naruto slowly and gently pushed his tongue into her mouth, running it across her teeth. Akitsu trembled slightly at the contact, but immediately opened her mouth and gently embraced his tongue with her own. It wasn't a fight for dominance. It was a gentle, sensual dance that would have brought a tear to the eye of anyone who might happen to stumble upon them and watch. Naruto brought his arms around Akitsu's shoulders and across her back, gently bringing her body into his own. Akitsu brought her hands up to Naruto's face and began caressing it before strumming her fingers through his hair. Both of them moaned softly before Akitsu's icy wings sprouted from her back with an even greater exuberance than before. Her wings actually grew so large that they forced the food and drinks behind her over to the ground, scattering them all over the surrounding area. At that moment, however, they didn't care. At that moment, the only thing that existed to them was each other, enveloped as they were in their intimate, sensual kiss. Akitsu could feel the depth of Naruto's love for her not only through the bond, but in his kiss as well. Both sensations seemed to make the love she felt from him that much more pronounced. She could say that for the first time ever, she didn't feel alone at all. She had no fear that he would abandon her, and she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he would regard her as his greatest treasure until the day he died, just like he would his other Sekirei. She belonged with him. She had a place in his family. She had a place in his heart, and he would make certain that she knew that. Eventually the two separated for air, with saliva stringing between them. They sat there catching their breath, both of them sporting intense blushes. Akitsu spared passing glances at her Ashikabi, her one true love, while Naruto just looked at her, abashed, and rubbed the back of his head, though his eyes were filled with love. He gave a warm smile and asked, "Does that answer your question?" Akitsu put a finger up to her lips and said quietly, "Ah yes, it does. And I love you just as much as you love me, Naruto." Naruto smiled knowingly as he answered, "I know you do. I never doubted that. If it's important to me that you know how much I love you, Akitsu, I'd give my life for you." Akitsu gasped at his admission. "For each of you. I'd go to the ends of the earth if that's what it took to make you happy." Akitsu smiled tearfully once more. "Ah, I assure you, Naruto, you don't need to go that far." Naruto chuckled sheepishly at that. Upon hearing Akitsu's growling stomach, they looked around and took notice of their food. "Guess we'll need to eat at a restaurant for dinner, too, huh?" he asked, again sheepishly, as none of the meal that Naruto had brought had survived the emergence of Akitsu's wings. Akitsu just nodded with a smile before they cleaned up their mess and left to find dinner at another restaurant. Naruto and Akitsu had finally decided to make their way back to Tazuna's house after dinner. Naruto was walking through town holding Akitsu in his arms in a bridal carry. Akitsu leaned contently into her Ashikabi's chest as she allowed him to carry her, both of them still in the clothes they had bought earlier. "Ah, thank you so much for today, Naruto. I needed this more than I realized," Akitsu expressed gratefully. "Of course, Akitsu. I'm glad we got to do this today, because I want our bond to grow, too," Naruto answered honestly. "And do you feel it has?" she asked expectantly. "By leaps and bounds," he answered immediately and warmly. "Yeah, me too," Akitsu trailed off, her voice getting weaker as she began to fall asleep in Naruto's arms. By the time Naruto arrived at the front door of his temporary home, Akitsu was fast asleep, exhausted from the activity and the novelty that the day had brought to her. "Man, I sure hope we get home first. Otherwise this is going to be real awkward." This thought passed through his head several times until they reached the house. He took a big breath and then grumbled. Everyone was sitting at the table eating dinner. Kurama was trying and failing to contain his laughter at the blonde's predicament and taunted. "You were saying?" "Shut the hell up," he retorted angrily. He walked in and, as luck would have it, stepped on the loudest creaking board in the house. This meant that every single eye immediately shot to him and the sleeping Akitsu. He rubbed the back of his head awkwardly and said, Yo." Most everyone was confused, but Uzum, Kakashi, and Tazuna all sported sly grins, slightly knowing but likely exaggerating what happened. Uzum wrapped an arm around his shoulder and whispered, "You gotta give me all the juicy details, bro." Naruto shivered, not just from what she said, but also from the way her breath snaked across his ear. Thanks mostly to his sheer embarrassment and partly to an intense degree of self-control, he didn't have to commit seppuku as a result of his pants shrinking and immediately shot off to his room before they could, huffing and panting against the door when he got there. He set Akitsu down on the bed, careful to not disturb her, then slumped to the ground against the door with a dark haze over his face and muttered, "Why me?" The next day was the day when Zabuza would attack Tazuna, so everyone did their best to prepare for the incoming battle. Their preparations had been turned up when Naruto told Kakashi about the fact that Kisame and 2 other Sekirei would be joining. When Kakashi asked who, Naruto told him that Taki didn't know, so she didn't tell him. Kakashi accepted that answer and they had their duties split up. Uzum and Hamura were told to stay at Tazuna's house to guard, and because they would have to fight that much harder against water-style attacks. though every male in attendance was forced to contain their nose blood when Yuzume appeared in her battle attire. Even Sasuke looked at Naruto and thought, lucky bastard. The group traveled there with Tazuna between them in a tight formation. The construction of the bridge was nearly finished, partly due to Naruto's insane number of shadow clones he let Tazuna use as grunt labor. As a result, there was barely 20 feet between one side and the other. This meant all that was needed was another couple days of construction, and they would have finished. Several days they obviously didn't get. When they arrived, Tazuna paled and ran towards his crew. Most were either dead or incapacitated. Tazuna went over to one of the only conscious workers and asked, "What happened here?" The man coughed and weakly answered, "Monsters, they were all monsters. Everyone was slaughtered. I only escaped by sheer luck." He hacked several more times before falling unconscious. Naruto stepped forward and sent out a pulse of chakra, checking for opponents. He found them, all of them. The first three he recognized as Zabuza, Haku, and Taki. There were three on the left that he couldn't identify, but assumed the one closest to Zabuza was Kasami due to the massive quantity of chakra. The others he couldn't identify, but the remaining four were all Sekirei. Though he noticed one had slightly more erratic chakra than the others, which likely meant she was unwinged. Adding to that was the intense stench of blood he got from that one, and the information he was given on Karasuba. He assumed that one was her. There was a thick mist pervading the area, and Naruto could tell by the chakra it contained that it was Taki's. He turned to Kakashi and nodded. Kakashi did the same and signed some instructions. Sakura, guard Tazuna. Sasuke, Naruto, divide the enemy and engage. I'll take Zabuza. They all nodded and went to their roles. Naruto ran into the mist and quickly met head-on with a person in hidden mist ambu gear. He tusked and said, "You must be Haku." She nodded and pulled out several senbon, then said, "I do not wish to kill you, but you are a roadblock to Master Zabuza's plans and must be eliminated. If you stand down now, I won't attack." Naruto responded quickly. TCH, not interested in surrendering to him. He was about to rush her. She flashed several hand signs and said, "Secret jutsu, crystal ice mirrors." Multiple body-sized mirrors of ice formed in a dome around him. Haku then stepped into one and projected herself into the others. "Damn, this is bad," Naruto cursed as Haku not only projected her appearance into each mirror, but her chakra as well, making it nearly impossible for him to decide which was the real one. Sasuke ran into the mist and stopped when a flash of silver crossed his path. He jumped back quickly but cringed when a cut formed on his cheek and dripped blood. He quickly wiped it off and got into a battle stance when Karasuba stepped into visible range. She laughed darkly and licked the tip of her blade and said, "You seem rather powerful. I can only hope you don't bore me. I'd love to see some of that hatred you have buried deep inside your heart. I want to see it released onto this battlefield and to fill my body with ecstasy." Sasuke cringed and thought, "Shit, she may be crazy, but she's obviously skilled with that sword. This isn't going to be easy." He got into a battle stance with a reverse-gripped kunai. Hibiki and Hikari walked into the mist and jumped back when a large object passed by them. Hibiki looked up tense and Hikari looked up annoyed and saw Kasame holding his sword on his shoulder with a big grin. He then said, "Two at once. Lucky me," he chortled as he unwrapped a portion of his sword, revealing dozens of large, blue, scale-like protrusions facing down on the sword. Benitsubasa walked up beside him with an irked expression and complained, "Hey Sharky, I'm still here." Kasame sighed and said, "Don't remind me." The Pinket just growled at him. Hibiki immediately realized that Kasame's sword would act like a cheese grater and told Hikari, "Careful, don't let his sword hit you or slice you to pieces." Hikari nodded and started charging electricity at her fingertips. Kakashi walked slowly into the mist and stopped when Zabuza came into view. "Well, shall we begin where we left off?" Zabuza taunted. Kakashi nodded and got into a fighting stance as Zabuza unsheathed his sword and swung it around several times before bringing it backwards. "Hopefully that annoying fire user won't get in the way this time," Zabuza said calmly. Kakashi responded in an equally conversational tone. "Don't worry, it's just you and me." Zabuza smirked under his bandages and said, "Perfect." Toyotama and Ikiya approached the group and were about to leave when Hikari and Hibiki approached from the mist. "No, 88 Musubai, I'm a fist type," she announced her name and number. The others responded in kind. "No, 07 Akitsu," she said in her usually bored tone. "No 16 Toyotama," she said, introducing herself. Toyotama was tall and had long green hair and blue eyes. She wore a white and blue belly top that revealed a lot of cleavage and had the Sekirei crest just above her left melon. She also wore long dark gloves and long brown stockings held by a garter over her bloomers with long dark boots. She wielded a long red spear. "No, 18 Ikiya," Ikiya said. She had dark skin and short black hair and dark gray eyes. She wore a yellow and purple leotard that wrapped around her and was held together by a ring just above her navel, and exposed portions of her midriff, sides, arms, and outer part of her thighs. Lastly, she wore long black boots and short black fingerless gloves. She used no weapons. With all the fighters in place, the battle on the bridge had begun. In the village hidden in the leaves, Miya was cleaning up around the dining living room and noticed a strange guest out on the veranda. She walked back and looked at her guest and said, My, isn't this a rarity for you, Kazehana? Why would you be here now? To siphon some of my sake? Or to beg for money? Maybe even to?" Kazehana smiled weakly as Miya went through a laundry list of different ulterior and shady reasons she could be there. Eventually, Kazehana just put her hands up and said, "Whoa, Miya," shaking her head, she said, "No, I'm not here for that, just waiting for someone." Miya tilted her head to the side and brought up her sleeve and said, "Oh, who might that be?" Kazehana chuckled and said, "Sorry, that's privy info." Miya nodded in understanding and asked, "So, when will he get here?" Kazehana's sweat dropped and said, "I figured it would take a little longer than that." The doorbell rang at the moment, and Kazehana slowly got up and made her way to the door with Miya directly behind. She approached the door and opened it, to revealing the smirking form of Asuma Sarutobi, actually wearing something besides his jounin uniform for once. He still wore his headband and guardian sash, but instead wore a light brown blazer with a cream-colored shirt underneath and olive-green slacks while smoking a cancer stick that he loved so dearly, though he still wore his shinobi sandals. He waved to Kazehana and asked, "Ready?" She nodded, and then a small wind picked up, slicing apart Asuma's cigarette. Looking down at his severed cigarette, he frowned and said with mock hurt, "That was mean." Kazehana just giggled behind her hand and teased, "I can't very well let you smoke since it messes with the wind, can I?" Asuma just shrugged and stuck out his elbow with a smirk. Kazehana wrapped her arm around his and waved to Miya as they left. If they had turned around, they would have seen Miya's normally gracefully formal smile slowly morphed into a soft, compassionate one as she turned to enter the inn and closed the door. In the land of waves at Tazuna's house, Homura and Yuzume stood guard at the house, very bored. Yuzume took a big yawn and started nodding off, only to get another fireball in the ass from Homura. "Would you stop that?" she shouted to the fire user. He smirked under his mask and said, "I refuse to do this alone, so I'll just keep you awake." Yuzume puffed out her cheeks and sighed, rubbing her head. "I know what you mean, but the bridge is covered in mist, and they've been there for over half an hour. I'm just getting worried." Homura nodded and said, "I understand. I can feel secure through the bond. While not frightened, she's scared, but our orders were to stay here, so we have to listen to them, got it?" Yuzume grumbled and said, "Yeah." Their attention was drawn to a perverted whistle. They glared over ready for a fight and saw two of Gado's thugs, one with shoulder-length bluish-white hair and one covered in scars. The bluish-white-haired one looked Yuzume up and down perversely while rubbing his chin. He then leered at her and said, "You look like you'd be fun. Come with us and we'll make sure Gado doesn't hurt you and show a good time." Unconsciously covering herself with her veils, she spit back, "Pig, only my Ashikabi looks at me like that." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't have time to ask as two veils shot at him. "Shit." He jumped to the side only to get grabbed by the ankle and smacked against a tree with a sickening crack. "Bitch," the other roared as he prepared to dice the woman apart, only to be blocked by Homura. "Move it, asshole." His response was a knee to the face followed by a burst of fire. The blue-haired man stood up and spat out while grabbing his cracked ribs. Damn, these guys are ninja. He was about to stand up when Yuzume wrapped him up and chopped him in the back of the neck, knocking him out. The other stood up only to get knocked down by Homura. Homura pointed his open hand at him and said calmly, "We only need one of you for interrogation." The man sweat profusely and looked at the fire user in fear. He was about to defend himself when he was set aflame, being burnt to a crisp. The battle on the bridge was set. It was Naruto vs. Haku, Sasuke vs. Karasuba, Musabai and Akitsu vs. Toyotama and Ikiya, Kakashi vs. Zabusa, Hikari and Hibiki vs. Kisame and Benitsubasa. Taki watched silently from sidelines, hoping her Ashikabi and his friends would win, and wholeheartedly believed they would. Hibiki dodged a series of strikes from Benitsubasa and then shoved her hands forwards and released a large pulse of electricity. The result was an electrified shockwave that knocked Benitsubasa into the air. She skidded to a stop with small twitches and said, "Great, I'm stuck with some bitch that shoots off lightning." She lunged forward and zigzagged past the lightning strikes that Hibiki launched and jumped into the air when she got close. She launched a spinning kick at her head. Hibiki brought her forearm up and braced it with chakra as Benitsubasa hit it. She grimaced at first, but then grabbed the pinkette's leg and smirked. Benitsubasa looked at her pissed off and confused until she felt lightning surging through her body in a current. To stop the flow, she kicked at Hibiki's arm. The calmer lightning twin let her go and jumped back. Hikari made a blade of electricity around her forearm and blocked the strike from Kisame. She immediately regretted that when she felt her chakra being sapped from her. Using her free hand, she zapped Kisame, causing him to break contact and jump back, though still grinning. "Not bad," he chortled. He looked at her with his sword braced in front of him and said, "Let's see how long you can keep it up." He then lunged at her with a violent flurry of swings and slashes. Hikari blocked the slashes wearily, losing chakra each time. Kisame made for a wide vertical swing. Hikari smirked and released a powerful pulse of lightning that threw him back. Kisame stood with several tears and cuts, but still sporting a toothy grin. In front of him, Hikari was kneeling, panting heavily, and covered in cuts and bruises. To make matters worse, she was nearly out of chakra thanks to shark skin. She looked at Kisame's grin and grit her teeth. He walked over and said, "This was fun. Too bad you've got to die now." He raised shark skin over his head and prepared to strike. He swung but was knocked down when something hit him in the back and sent him flying. He looked to his right and saw Benitsubasa covered in burns and swirls in her eyes. Kisame's sweat dropped and said, "She's seriously in the disciplinary squad." She came to, looked around, and then stood up. She looked at the panting Hibiki and shouted, "You're really pissing me off." "Damn, how much energy does this bitch have?" Hibiki cursed as the fist fighter seemed to run on infinite. Her eyes widened what she saw next. Benitsubasa glanced at Kisame, who sighed. He put shark skin up against her shoulder and transferred some chakra to the pinkette. Hibiki snarled and said to Hikari, "This is bad. In addition to her own never-ending stamina, he keeps fueling her with his own." Hikari nodded and suggested, "So we need to separate them." Hibiki nodded, and the two ran and flanked the two warriors. Kisame grinned and pulled shark skin away as he jumped out the twins' path. Benitsubasa growled and jumped over Hikari's head and landed behind her. The twins smirked and did an immediate heel turn, then charged at their opponents, effectively separating them. Hikari stood across from Benitsubasa in a standoff. Hikari charged electricity in her feet and extended it subtly towards Benitsubasa. The pinkette felt a slight tingle and looked around, then noticed Hikari's grin. "What's so funny?" she screeched. Hikari released the electricity in a stream and vanished, only to reappear right in front of a stunned Benitsubasa. "This is brand new technique I came up with. I call it atomic transfer," she bragged as she coiled up her right arm and charged it with electricity. Benitsubasa brought her arms to block, which was a bad idea as Hikari's electrified fists slammed into her arms, sending electricity surging through her body as well as sending her flying. She tried to bolster herself with her arms, but discovered they were numb. Hikari launched forward by utilizing the chakra jump's shinobi use and came right in front of Benitsubasa and said with a grin, There's a reason my number's higher than yours, disciplinary squad or not. She coiled up her leg and launched an electrified roundhouse kick at the pinkhead. Benitsubasa screeched in pain as the kick shocked her badly and sent her plummeting into the water below. Hibiki dodged swipe after swipe from Kasame's sword, trying to keep far enough away to not get her chakra taken. Seeing an opening when Kasame overswung, Hibiki shot a lightning bolt at him. Kasame received a nasty shock and stumbled back from the attack. After a second to recover, he looked at Hibiki and grinned. He charged at the Sekirei and started swinging with renewed vigor. Dodging the repeated swings, some getting close enough to sap a little chakra, Hibiki thought, how much energy does this bastard have? Her thoughts were cut short when Kasame jabbed at her with shark skin, the blow strong enough to make her cough up blood. He grinned and hoisted her and his sword over his head and slammed her against the ground with a loud crash. He brought his sword up to strike again, but was stopped by an electrified snap kick to the back of the head, shocking him and sending tumbling along the ground. Hikari knelt down to check on her injured sister. "Hibiki, are you all right?" Hibiki coughed and spit out some blood, but looked at her sister and nodded weakly. They looked ahead and tensed when they heard Kasame cackling. "Lucky me, I get twins. Isn't this supposed to be every man's dream or something?" He chortled with shark skin resting on his shoulder. The twins got into a taijutsu stance and charged their hands. "We haven't got much chakra left. We need to finish this quick," Hibiki said. Her sister nodded and they charged at Kasame with a scissor move. Kasame grinned and jumped in the air, exactly what they wanted. Hibiki charged a ball of lightning in her hand that crackled and stretched, and then tossed it up at Kasame. Kasame grunted as the ball of lightning stuck to him and then exploded, sending him soaring through the air with his cloak mostly destroyed. He opened his eyes and saw Hikari above him with her leg glowing with lightning. He grinned worriedly and sweat dropped, then thought, uh-oh. Hikari gave him an axe kick that released a bolt of lightning a moment later, sending him crashing into the bridge and then straight through it. He splashed into the water below with a huge shockwave. The lightning twins watched apprehensively as the water evened out and became still again. They sighed with relief and slumped down back to back when Kasame didn't resurface. "Damn, I thought he'd never go down," Hikari said with a heavy sigh while rubbing her sore leg. "Kicking him hurt more than I thought it would." Hibiki glared weakly at her sister and said, "I don't want to hear it. I'm going to have to request a new suit from MBI, since this thing's just about shredded thanks to that sword of his." The two of them sighed as they focused on their bond to find Kakashi and became immediately worried by the shock and anger he had. They immediately stood up to try and find him. Sasuke was in the middle of an upended battle. Karasuba was stronger, faster, and more nimble than he was. He tried getting in close with a kunai jab, but she just kicked him away. He attempted to hit her with a fireball, but she amazingly and calmly sliced it in half, sending the halves crashing to the ground in a fiery blaze behind her. He tried a barrage of shuriken, kunai, and paper bombs, but Karasuba dodged or deflected them all with ease. What pissed him off even more was that it was obvious she wasn't even trying. Eventually, he got past her guard and tried punch her solar plexus, but she kneed him in the gut and then kicked his airborne body back, sending him careening into a pile of crates and supplies. He looked up to see Karasuba walking toward him with a disappointed expression. She saw the fear in his eyes and scowled. "I thought you would be more exciting than this. The hatred you harbor for your brother is intense, yet it is useless because you can only direct it at him." Sasuke grit his teeth and shouted, "He killed my entire clan. Of course my hatred is focused on him." Karasuba scowled further and picked Sasuke up by his collar and said, "Hatred is strongest when you can direct it anywhere. It becomes your greatest ally when you can project it on anyone or anything." She snickered and said, "Your hatred is far too weak. Do you know why your brother will always beat you?" Sasuke glared hate at her as she pulled him close. She whispered in his ear, "You don't have enough hatred, and you never will." Sasuke's mind snapped. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists and teeth. His eyes snapped open, and he sent a lightning-fast kick at Karasuba that barely managed to graze her, but still left a scuff mark on her cheek. She looked at him and grinned like a mad woman. His irises were red with one tomo in the left eye and two in the other. His fledgling Sharingan had awakened, though he was unaware of that fact. Karasuba smiled and dashed towards him a short horizontal slash. Sasuke's reaction time slowed because he was surprised as she seemed to be moving in slow motion. Waking himself up, he jumped back to dodge the attack. Seeing this, she smirked again. After that, she attacked him with a flurry of strikes that were a blur to anyone else, but Sasuke could see like extremely fast strikes that he was barely able to dodge. This was better than not dodging at all like he had been. He jumped back and made several hand signs, fire style, phoenix flower jutsu. He launched a fireball that quickly split into multiple smaller ones. Karasuba dodged the fireballs but opened her eyes in curiosity when she heard a sizzling noise. She turned around with a combined look of surprise and annoyance. He hid paper bombs in the fireballs. Smooth. She jumped to the side and was immediately faced by Sasuke, who launched a series of punches and kicks that Karasuba dodged effortlessly. Sasuke landed and HN'd at the failure. He launched several shuriken and shouted, "Shadow Shuriken Jutsu." 5 shuriken became 25. Karasuba gave him a close-eyed smile and used her sword to easily deflect them all like they were nothing. Sasuke growled and then dashed forward with a wide kick. Karasuba caught his kick but raised an eyebrow when he smirked. He brought up a one-handed sign and said, "Release." Karasuba released his leg and cringed as she felt a small burst of electricity surge through her. She stood up with a scowl that quickly morphed into a smile and asked, "I wonder how you did that." He reached into the leg warmer on his left leg and pulled out a seal. He smirked and said, "It's something Naruto gave me that I charge with lightning chakra." Karasuba chuckled and said, "He's a bright one then." Sasuke scowled and tossed the used seal aside. "Whatever. You're annoying." Karasuba cracked her eyes with a devious smirk before dashing forward at meteoric speeds. Sasuke widened his eyes and tensed his muscles awaiting her attack. She swung diagonally and Sasuke blocked with a kunai as his legs bent under the pressure. Pumping chakra into his arms, he pushed back and managed to knock her off. She smirked and jumped back, then circled around and tried to bisect him from behind. Seeing that with his Sharingan, he was able to flip over the attack. She swung vertically and Sasuke planted his foot on the blade. Fortunately, it didn't cut through his sandal, and he propelled off. She bolted forward as Blur. Sasuke was just barely able to block the attack with his kunai, but it caused him to slide back. Karasuba repeated that multiple times, knocking into Sasuke at speeds he could barely track. After several goes at this, Sasuke was reaching his limits. Even with his Sharingan awakened and all of his skills, he was still far outclassed by Karasuba. She knew that. He was on one knee panting heavily from chakra exhaustion and injury. He looked up to see Karasuba sauntering over to him and scowled. When she approached him, she looked him in the eyes and smirked. His Sharingan were spinning ever so slowly, showing his current rage. She chuckled and said, "Good, you're letting your anger spread outwards, using your rage towards your brother and directing it towards me. It's weak, but I can feel it from you." She paused and knelt down. Then she cupped a hand under his chin and looked him in the eyes and said, "Your hatred is too weak for now, but in time it will grow. And when it does, seek me out and I will be yours. Together we can watch this world burn to ash." She began to speak with increasing enthusiasm. "Shut up," he cried. "Don't talk about Itachi, especially in front of me." Karasuba's grin simply increased further as she stood. "I should kill you right here and now." She drove the point home by bringing her sword up to his throat, him being too weak to move. She then added, "But your hatred and rage intrigue me." She pulled her sword away and sheathed it as she walked away. Before she was no longer visible, she turned halfway and looked at Sasuke over her shoulder. "You don't interest me now, boy. Your hatred is too weak, but when it is stronger," she crinkled her eyes in a grin, "come find me again, and we will talk." She turned and walked away, leaving Sasuke unable to move. After several seconds he began to tremble. He then slammed his fist into the ground. "Damn it," he shouted. "Damn it, damn it, damn it," he said, pounding the ground each time. "If I couldn't even beat her, then I could know I will grow stronger and destroy both her and Itachi. I swear," he thought in rage. Kakashi clashed in a battle of blades with Zabuza. Kakashi was using the Leaf's standard chakra blade, which absorbs chakra and releases it as a 3-foot blue energy blade. Zabuza was using the Executioner's blade. The two stood with their blades locked in a standoff until Kakashi felt the shift created by Zabuza putting more weight into the strike and jumped back. He threw multiple kunai that Zabuza blocked by bringing up the flat edge of the blade and then vanished into the mist. Kakashi looked around trying to locate the swordsman. He felt a slight shift in air pressure and turned around instantly. He brought his blade to the side and braced it with his other hand as Zabuza's vertical swing came in. For added assurance, Kakashi locked himself to the bridge with chakra. The massive blade hit home and Kakashi winced at the force. He swung his blade up and out swiftly and stabbed forward, impaling Zabuza in the abdomen. Kakashi frowned when he turned into a puddle of water. Kakashi sighed and said tiredly, "I guess it's time to use my trump card." Zabuza raised an eyebrow and became slightly visible and wondered out loud, "Oh, and what would that be?" Kakashi turned to face Zabuza and reached up to his headband and lifted it, revealing his left eye to be closed and with a long vertical scar. He opened it and revealed a fully matured Sharingan. Zabuza chuckled and said, "I see. So that's why they call you Kakashi the Copy Ninja." Kakashi got into a Kenjutsu pose and elongated the blade of his sword with more chakra. Zabuza charged at him with a horizontal swing that Kakashi blocked easily. Kakashi then rushed forward, grinding his blade against Zabuza's and then swung wide and fast. Zabuza jumped back narrowly, avoiding the slash that would have cut open his abdomen. He frowned and said, "That eye makes you fast." Kakashi didn't respond as Zabuza went at him with another swing that Kakashi dodged easily. He jumped back and skidded, then stuck his sword in the ground right when Zabuza did the same. Zabuza narrowed his eyes and prepared a jutsu, but widened his eyes in surprise when he noticed Kakashi preparing the same jutsu. Water style, raging waves, they called simultaneously, shooting powerful blasts of water from their mouths that collided with a powerful splash. After the water cleared, they grabbed their swords and charged again. Zabuza took a low horizontal swing while Kakashi made a high vertical slash. Their blades met in the middle and Kakashi grimaced as Zabuza used the momentum and power he had to toss Kakashi over him. Kakashi shifted his weight to do several midair spins before landing back on the ground and charged to the side right as Zabuza did the same. Zabuza shot off to his right with a burst of chakra and Kakashi to his own left at the same time. They locked blades again, but this time they were. Zabuza scowled and broke contact, jumping back and skidding. He reached into his pouch and threw a volley of shuriken. Kakashi did so as well. Their shuriken met and clashed in the middle, canceling each other out. Zabuza grimaced and thought, "What is going on? He's copying every move I make. He's nothing more than a monkey." "You know, Zabuza, if you surrender now, I'll see if Leaf Village can give you a less painful sentence," Kakashi taunted. The taunt seemed to work as Zabuza glowered and made a hand sign for the water clone. His eyes widened in shock as Kakashi did the same. Water clone jutsu, they both called, creating 4 clones each that charged. The clones burst into puddles and Zabuza was trembling with a mixture of anger and shock. He smirked and decided to use something more volatile since there was so much water on the bridge. Ushi, Saru, Yu, Ni, I, Tori, Ushi, Uma. They both chanted as they went through a massive number of hand signs. Zabuza trembled in disbelief as this happened. It can't be. It's like he's able to predict my moves even before I do. Wait, what's that?" he near shouted as something phased into existence behind Kakashi, a shadowed figure of Zabuza himself. "Ni, I, Tori," they shouted. The two then called Water Style, Water Dragon Jutsu. The numerous water puddles along the bridge from their own battle, as well as the others, migrated to 2 points in the air along with water from the ocean below. Then, 2 massive, serpentine dragons made of water with glowing amber eyes formed and charged at each other, with Kakashi's biting Zabuza's in the neck and dispelling it, before crashing in the man himself. The torrent of water sent Zabuza crashing into one of the construction's pillars and bending it. He managed to hang on before Kakashi pinned him to it. The copy ninja then teleported to atop it, panting as Zabuza weakly glared at him and asked, "Can you see the future?" Kakashi narrowed his eyes and said calmly, "Yes, and I see your death." Zabuza smirked and turned into a puddle of water. Kakashi's eyes widened when Zabuza's foot slammed into his back and sent him crashing into the bridge, rolling to a stop. Zabuza now stood atop the pillar with a smirk. "Right. If you could see the future, you'd have seen that coming." Kakashi narrowed his eyes and stood up with a grunt and a sigh and said, "Good point." "Also, Kakashi," Zabuza said, getting a weak glare from the silver-haired Jonin. "I've figured something out. I just needed a little test." Kakashi narrowed his eyes and asked venomously, "What?" "That eye of yours, it doesn't predict my movements, it controls them." Kakashi winced and Zabuza chuckled. "So I was right, huh?" Kakashi glared and said, "What's your point?" Zabuza chuckled and snapped his fingers and said, "To beat it, all I need to do is keep my eyes away from yours." The mist thickened and Kakashi said, "If I can't see you, then you can't see me. So it's a nice plan but fundamentally flawed." Zabuza chuckled as his voice came from every direction. "Oh Kakashi," he drawled. "You forget, I'm a master of silent killing. All I need is the slightest breath, the slightest shuffle of the clothing to hone in on you exactly." Kakashi narrowed his eyes and thought, "Think Kakashi, where will he attack?" He looked around and then became frantic. Tazuna and Sekirei. The two flinched as Zabuza appeared and swung his sword. Kakashi dashed forward and tried to reach them, but knew he wouldn't make it. Right before Zabuza's blade connected, two purple swords of electricity blocked him. He scowled as Hibiki and Hikari stood trembling under the force of his attack. Sekirei beamed, "Hibiki, Hikari." Hikari turned to her and said, "Come on. You didn't really think we'd let the most fashionable of Kakashi's students bite it, did you?" Sekirei laughed as Tazuna sighed. Hibiki glared at Zabuza and, with her free hand, launched an electrified punch that Zabuza jumped back to dodge, only to receive a roundhouse from Kakashi. Zabuza roared in pain and then flipped backwards over Kakashi's foot and tumbled along the bridge. He stood up panting and said, "Damn you." "You know Zabuza," Kakashi began, eliciting a scowl from the rogue shinobi. "I've heard about how you left the Mist Village after attempting to assassinate Yagura. You also vowed to go back and take him down. I suppose that's your dream, isn't it? To take back the mist?" Zabuza growled and shouted, "Silence! Keep your damned ideas to yourself." Kakashi sighed, covered his sharingan and said, "But to fulfill that dream, you needed two things, money and a future. Which, thanks to how far you've fallen, you have neither." Zabuza smirked and said, "No sharingan anymore." Kakashi looked at Zabuza straight-faced and said, "No, no more copied jutsu. Specially for you, I'll give a jutsu I made all by myself." Naruto began his battle with Haku by pulsing chakra, trying to find any variation that would tip him off to which was the original. Haku, feeling the pulse, pulled out several senbon and said calmly, "That won't work." After several seconds, Naruto realized she was right and cursed. That tactic failing, he tried another. Multi-shadow clone jutsu. Hundreds of clones started to fill the space and attempted to blow out the mirrors, but were dispelled as Haku threw multiple senbon barrages out. A few even managed to hit Naruto himself. Damn, that didn't work either. He then tried to blow them out with great breakthrough. His reward was another volley of senbon burying themselves in his skin. He cursed again and tried to come up with a plan. "Your strategies will all fail. Even if you manage to break the mirror I'm in, I can simply jump from the shards to another whole mirror and then replace the broken one immediately," she said plainly. Naruto growled and said, "Well, this sucks." She jumped out of the mirror, launching more senbon. Naruto dodged. Naruto smirked and said, "Well, looks like I get to try one of my new tricks." Haku quirked an eyebrow but prepared for his attack. Forming his favorite hand sign, he said, "Multi-shadow clone jutsu." 20 clones appeared in the dome. Haku retorted calmly, "This again?" She jumped and threw more senbon. Her eyes widened when the clones, instead of bursting into puffs of smoke, exploded with extreme force. Surprise and the attack itself made it so that Haku barely got back into one of the mirrors but was still burnt by the explosion. Naruto smirked and said, "Got her." His smirk lowered when Haku jumped from several mirrors and impaled with dozens of senbon. He grit his teeth as he pulled several of them out. He looked up and started formulating another plan, but had to stop when Haku launched another attack. She jumped from one mirror to another and launched multiple senbon, then sunk into that mirror and jumped and attacked again. Naruto jumped, skipped, and rolled to dodge, still managing to get stuck with a few. Damn, Kurama, I need chakra to my senses, mostly my eyes. Kurama raised an eyebrow, but loaned the blonde a small drip of his chakra, causing the blonde's pupils to become slitter but not to change otherwise. Naruto calmed himself and watched Haku jump out again. She was just barely a blur to him, but he could at least tell where she was going. He then noticed something as they kept up their dance of Haku jumping and striking, with Naruto then dodging. Every couple jumps Haku's speed would decrease, her visage becoming clearer each time. He smirked and thought, so long as I can keep dodging, she should slow down enough for me to get a few strikes. He then concentrated on the bond to see how each of his Sekirei were doing. Akitsu was struggling but still had confidence, so he wasn't too worried. Musabai was a flurry of excitement. She was fighting a powerful opponent. All he could do was sweat drop. Taki was worried on the outside of the mist wall. He sent a small burst of calming emotions that seemed to work. Uzum just seemed annoyed. Deciding they were in acceptable condition, he enacted his plan. He dodged volley after volley, never retaliating. Eventually, he noticed that Haku's visage had become a slightly distorted view of herself rather than a blur, noting how far her speed had fallen. He waited until she threw her last volley and then charged a rasengan. He lunged at her next destination. He was slightly too slow as he missed his chance, and she escaped to another mirror, then reformed the one he broke. Naruto waited again and then lashed out when she landed. While he didn't hit her square on, he noticed that a portion of her right sleeve was torn. He smirked at his little victory, only to cringe as he felt his own chakra starting to fail. That was bad. While he could easily use Kurama's chakra, he preferred not to, as even without Kurama's its chakra would strengthen his anger and control him through it on its own accord. He decided this had been ended swiftly. Naruto continued dodging Haku until he saw an opening. He charged as much chakra as he could and lunged at another mirror with a rasengan, right as Haku headed toward it. No, Haku thought worriedly. The rasengan connected with Haku's torso, tearing her clothes around her abdomen and shredding her bindings before launching her through the mirror. Haku tumbled and rolled along the ground, skidding to a halt. The mirrors shattered and fell around Naruto, panting as he deactivated Kurama's chakra and went to one knee. Haku sat up weakly and asked, "Tell me, why do you fight?" Naruto raised an eyebrow and responded, "Why do you want to know?" She gave a weak smile and said, "Just the musings of a dying woman." Naruto narrowed his eyes but shrugged and decided to answer anyway. "I fight to protect my friends and to become Hokage," he said proudly. Haku smiled and asked, "Is there anyone truly precious to you?" Naruto was utterly puzzled but answered anyway, "Lots of people." Haku, still smiling, said, "Then I'm sure you'll be very strong." Naruto raised an eyebrow as she stood shakily, and he then got ready to fight. Haku put up her hand and said, "Don't worry, I'm in no condition to fight anymore." Calmed, he decided to ask her something. "What did you mean by I'll be very strong?" She answered warmly, "Because a person is truly strong when they have someone to protect." Naruto glared and said distastefully, "Like Zabuza?" She nodded. "He may seem cruel, but he wasn't always like that." Naruto was confused again but let her speak. "You see, we both come from the village hidden in the mist. Roughly 20 years ago, the land of water was embroiled in a civil war. People like me with Kekkei Genkais were used as mercenaries and were fearsome opponents. Eventually, the new Mizukage, Yagura, came to power and the civil war ended. But for those born with Kekkei Genkai, it still continued." Naruto's eyes widened and he asked, "What? But why?" Haku shook her head. Because the horror stories of what those with Kekkei Genkai could do had spread, and the people became fearful of them. Seeing this, Yagura decided to ingratiate himself to the people by casting a nationwide order to kill all Kekkei Genkai users on sight. There were many clans that were snuffed out due to this order, but one clan stood above the rest as the most feared. Naruto gulped and asked, What was it? My clan, the Yuki clan. Know this, my mother went into hiding and hid her identity as a member of the Yuki clan. Eventually, she married a simple farmer and had a daughter, me. But when I was 4 years old, I discovered my ice-style Kekkei Genkai. My mother became petrified and told me never to use it again. But my father had seen me use it. Naruto didn't like where she was going. He gathered a band of men and killed my mother, then tried to kill me. I reacted on instinct and killed them all. I was chased out of the village and was forced to live on my own for 3 years. Naruto nodded, knowing exactly what that was like. Haku, catching his meaning, smiled and continued. When I was 7 years old, Zabuza found me. He was still an enlisted jonin at the time. Though he didn't do so in an official capacity, he took me in and started to raise me after realizing I was the last member of the Yuki clan. She looked up towards the sky with nostalgia as she continued. I pledged myself to serve him as his tool, since he had seen me not as a horrible monster, but as a person with a special gift. Naruto sported a smile, remembering when Aruka looked past Kurama and saw him, not his tenant. His smile was also sad because of how Haku let herself be treated by Zabuza. Eventually, one of Zabuza's comrades discovered my abilities and turned me in to the authorities, along with him for harboring me. Realizing they were going to kill me, Zabuza rebelled and killed everyone there. Then he took me out of the Mist Village and made a promise. He said, I will build an army, I will return here, and I will take back my home from Yagura's oppression. Naruto was surprised how similar that goal was to his oath of becoming Hokage. After a short pause, she began again. Things became bad shortly after that. After a few short years, we amassed a small band and assaulted the Mizukage. The entire group, save for me and Zabuza, were killed. Naruto continued to listen and could do little more than seethe at how truly devoted Haku was to Zabuza and how he treated her in return. After several missions, we ended up finding and bringing Taki with us. I never knew where she came from, but Zabuza openly accepted her in. Soon after that, however, the deaths seemed to get to him, along with frustration. The only real fighting force we picked up after that were a few dozen rogue Chunin and the Akuma brothers. Zabuza was friendly with them at first. Unfortunately, the Chunin kept dying on the missions Zabuza undertook. He mourned his lost comrades at first, though not openly. He eventually stopped being close to his soldiers and became cold and distant. I think he learned of Taki's Sekirei status early on. I can't say what that had to do with the abuse, but I try to think it was at least grounded on good intentions. Naruto interrupted there and said, good intentions can lead to bad outcomes, I would know. He instinctively put a hand over his stomach. Confused at his action, Haku nodded and answered, true, I believe his original intent was to drive her away so she didn't react to him. But it eventually devolved into him taking out his pent-up rage more than anything. She looked down sadly and continued, I had always hoped Zabuza would go back to normal, but it seems I won't get the chance to see it if he does. Naruto was confused by what she said, and became further puzzled when she erected an ice mirror and stepped into it. The mirror shattered and she vanished, leaving a very puzzled Naruto. At the same time, Kakashi flashed several hand signs and then slammed his hand and said, summoning, fanged pursuit jutsu. Zabuza braced himself for whatever beast the copy ninja conjured, but became confused and unnerved when nothing happened. Zabuza smirked and taunted, run out of chakra did we? Kakashi made several more hand signs and charged chakra into his right hand and said, you shouldn't just look around. Zabuza raised an eyebrow, but had no time to think when the ground burst around him. He felt sharp pains all over, and when the dust cleared he scowled when he saw the source. He had multiple ninja hounds, ranging from a small pug to a massive bulldog, holding him in place with claws and teeth. He then heard a strange sound. He looked forward and went wide-eyed. Enveloping Kakashi's right hand was a sparking, jolting ball of electricity. You're about to see something special, Kakashi said. My own original jutsu, the lightning blade. Kakashi charged forward with his lightning-encased hand swung behind him. Zabuza tried to get free, but it was pointless. Kakashi thrust his hand forward and time slowed down for all involved. An ice mirror rose into existence and Haku stepped out, holding her hands out to the side to stop Kakashi. Zabuza just watched coldly as Kakashi's jutsu pierced Haku right through the chest, his hand going all the through and out her back. Kakashi's mind took a moment to register what had happened. He immediately removed his hand from her chest and jumped back, causing her lifeless body to fall to the ground. Zabuza was freed from the dogs and had no reaction at all. He just looked at Kakashi with annoyance. Akitsu slammed into one of the bridge's barricades and stood up shakily. She looked forward and rolled to the side as Ikiya sent her an axe kick that splintered the plaster. Akitsu formed several ice spears and shot them at Ikiya. Ikiya ran forward easily dodging each one and gave Akitsu a roundhouse kick that she blocked with a wall of ice. Akitsu jumped back right before it shattered and Ikiya's leg burst through. Akitsu still displayed her bored expression, albeit with sweat trickling down her forehead. Ikiya never lost her confident grin and charged at the ice user. Toyotama was having the opposite situation with her target. She was skilled with a spear, but Musubai never seemed to stop moving. Toyotama gave a wide slash that Musubai hopped back to avoid. Musubai then jumped up to dodge a downward slice. She then lunged with a powerful kick that Toyotama blocked with her staff. Toyotama grimaced at the blow's power, which caused her to skid back. When she felt the kinetic energy die down a little, she pushed back, sending Musubai twirling through the air to land on her feet with a big smile. Toyotama scoffed at this girl's sheer stubbornness and ran at her with a lunge. Musubai dodged to the side and smiled triumphantly. What she didn't notice was Toyotama's smirk. She pulled her hand back to the end of her spear and swung it horizontally, acting essentially like a bludgeoning weapon. Musubai didn't have time to react and yelped in pain as the spear's staff collided with her side and sent her tumbling to the ground. She got up with a wince and jumped back when the spear stabbed at the ground. She skidded to a stop and then ran at the green-haired spear wielder with a powerful kick that she telegraphed like a neon sign. Toyotama tilted her head to side with a smirk but hadn't counted on the other foot as it collided with her face. Musubai then used her curled leg like a spring and launched herself back, sending Toyotama into backflip that caused her head to collide with the pavement. Musubai cheered happily. "Yay, I got her." Toyotama stood up with a bloody nose and rubbed the back of her head and cursed. "Damn, that was pretty good." After regaining her senses, she got back into another stance and prepared to stab Musubai. She stabbed high, slashed low, swung vertically, and then slashed shoulder to hip. Musubai dodged each and every attack but got her shirt nicked by the slash. Akitsu and Ikiya were at a proverbial stalemate. Akitsu had the advantage on range, able to launch hundreds of ice spears at long distances. Ikiya had the advantage in strength and speed. She was fast enough to dodge most of the spears and strong enough to destroy the others before they hit. This back and forth lasted for quite a time until Ikiya lost her balance on some of the ground that had been frozen during their fight. Taking immediate advantage, Akitsu launched as many ice shards as she could. Ikiya was able to plant her hands on the ground just in time to go through some acrobatics to dodge most of the flying shards, but still got scraped in a few spots. Throwing caution to the wind and getting fed up, Akitsu decided to use a new technique she had developed recently. She encased her forearm in ice and the end tapered off to a point, resulting in her arm becoming an ice sword. Ikiya grinned and taunted. "Please, I'm faster and stronger. You really think you can beat me because of some fancy weapon?" Akitsu charged at her instead of answering. Meanwhile, Musubai was busy trading blows with Toyotama. Musubai was hard-pressed to get close, but still managed to land a few good hits now and then, but had most of her clothing shredded by Toyotama's spear along with multiple shallow cuts. Toyotama panted, watching the near-nude Sekirei bounce excitedly on the balls of her feet, covered in bruises and cuts, and was in disbelief. "Why?" she asked. Musubai stopped hopping and tilted her head. "Why what?" Toyotama sighed and asked again, more detailed, "Why are you fighting so hard for your Ashikabi?" Musubai tilted her head to the other side. "Because he's my Ashikabi," she said plainly. Toyotama scratched her head furiously and pointed her spear at her accusingly. "So, what makes him so special that you wouldn't have surrendered by now?" Musubai scrunched her nose in thought, then answered, "Would you?" Toyotama scoffed at her question. TCH, of course. My Ashikabi sees me as nothing more than a disposable asset. Musubai put a finger on her chin and asked, disposable asset. Toyotama sighed and clarified. It means unless I'm useful he doesn't care about me. Wait, why am I telling you this? She shouted with exaggerated motions. Musubai gasped. That's horrible. Toyotama stopped and looked completely confused. Isn't yours like that? Musubai shook her head furiously. No, not at all. He's kind, funny, hardworking, and extremely caring. Even now, I can tell through that bond that even though he's in a life or death situation, he's more concerned about us than himself. Toyotama smiled sadly at that. You sound lucky. It seems like your Ashikabi really loves you. Musubai nodded emphatically. He does, he does. Toyotama sighed and said, Wish I was so lucky. Doesn't matter, she said with a shake of her head. I still need to beat you. Musubai nodded. Right. Maybe if you show how useful you are, your Ashikabi will start to love you too. Toyotama gave another sad smile and whispered, Doubt it. Akitsu slashed at Ikiya with her ice blade, but the other Sekirei dodged and threw a kick at the ice user. Akitsu jumped back to dodge and launched several ice shards. Ikiya smirked and did an airborne spin kick to destroy them, but was caught off guard Akitsu's ice blade stabbing from a low angle. Ikiya grit her teeth and launched an axe kick, smashing it into the back of Ice Sekirei's head, sending her sliding across the ground. Akitsu attempted to lift herself up, but was stopped when Ikiya stomped on her back, resulting in a cry of pain. Ikiya grinned and said, Is this really all you've got? So much for the legendary single numbers. She smashed her foot into Akitsu's back again as Akitsu cried in pain. Akitsu tried to stand again and thought, Naruto, he's willing to fight to the end for us. I must be willing to do the same. Akitsu formed several ice spears that extended from behind her, trying to impale Ikiya. Ikiya jumped back and grunted in annoyance and charged at the downed Sekirei again. Musubai held the end of Toyotama's spear in between her hands, the two standing almost completely still. They trembled sparsely as they tried to overpower the other. Eventually, Musubai seemed to get an idea and twisted her hands to the right, snapping the blade off Toyotama's spear. Toyotama pulled the end towards her, looked at it, then blinked several times. She looked at Musubai holding her spear's blade and blinked several times, until she put two and two together and let out a surprised, Gah. She then pointed at the fist type and said, You broke my spear. Musubai smiled and said, Well, that thing was really dangerous. I didn't feel like getting cut anymore. Toyotama just sighed, tossed her broken spear aside and said, Screw it, I'm done. You win this fight, but I'll beat you next time. Musubai pouted, Awa, you're giving up. Toyotama shrugged. I'm a weapon type. Take away my weapon, and I'm not as good in a fight. I was barely able to keep up with you with it. I'd get demolished without it. Musubai put her finger to her chin and said, That's a good point. So next time then? She asked happily. Toyotama nodded with a small smile and said, Yeah, next time. The two were brought out their conversation by a blood-curdling scream. They ran over and Toyotama looked disappointed, while Musubai looked terrified. Lying in a small crater on her stomach was Akitsu, unconscious and possibly even dead. On top of her with a foot planted firmly in her back was Ikiya, who had a mile-wide grin. Guess that means I win. Musubai ran over to tend to Akitsu but was knocked away by Ikiya. She glared indignantly and cried, Why'd you do that? Ikiya snorted and said, She's my trophy. When I finish with her, you can have what's left. Musubai glared again and was about to yell again when Toyotama beat her to it. Ikiya, she's been deactivated. You win. Stop this, she said with growing anger and fear at her teammate. Ikiya scoffed at her and said, I beat her, so I get to decide what I do. She grabbed Akitsu by the hair and lifted her up. I beat one of the legendary single numbers, so of course I'm going to want some kind of trophy. She looked around and noticed something glint. She pulled back Akitsu's hair and saw the earrings. Perfect. She reached down to take them but froze when Akitsu, despite being near death, grabbed her hand and glared tiredly at her. She then said, You will not take these. She squeezed harder but Ikiya knocked her in the back of the head and glared while she nursed her hand. She prepared to grab them again when a deafening cry rang through the battlefield. The three Sekirei looked to their left and everyone else looked towards the end of the bridge as the mist cleared up. Standing near the group of Sekirei was Naruto, with a shocked and enraged face, seeing Akitsu unconscious and bloody on the ground with Ikiya kneeling on top of her. He was incapable of speech and just stood there trembling. Musubai looked at him and spoke to try and comfort him. "Naruto," she trailed off and covered her eyes at the next occurrence. The wind of the battlefield suddenly shifted as Naruto's appearance changed. Most notably his eyes, his pupils slitted again and his irises turned red. A red aura surrounded him and he shouted with a demonic rage, "Damn you!" "Naruto," Musubai said sympathetically, trying to comfort him only to shrink back at the sensation he was giving through the bond. Kakashi and Zabuza watched with differing emotions. Kakashi watched with sadness and sympathy. Naruto was only 15, he shouldn't have seen someone so important to him die so soon, especially considering the life he's had. Zabuza couldn't decide what he felt. He felt sadness, both towards the boy and for him, and somewhere else he couldn't pinpoint. Anger, though he couldn't tell why, and a general feeling of numbness towards everything around him. Taki could only watch from the side with her hands over her mouth in sheer shock. Not only could she see the rage he had visible on him, the emotion being sent through the bond was overwhelming. A kind of rage she couldn't describe, it was deafening. Sasuke watched with clenched fists. For the first time in his life, he could sympathize perfectly with someone. He knew exactly how they felt. It sickened him, and not just the sympathy he felt, but at knowing the same feelings of rage and disbelief that coursed through his mind and body 4 years ago were now surging through Naruto. Those feelings were crippling and blinding. They just resulted in strengthening themselves. He glared at that scene, trying to decide what to do, when the weakness in his right leg informed him of what his decision was. Naruto's mind was blank. He had nothing but the surging emotions of rage, hatred, despair, and vengeance going through his mind. Unconsciously, he had started to draw on massive quantities of Kurama's chakra. It caused his pupils to become slitted and his irises to turn blood red. His nails and canines elongated and sharpened, his canines becoming inch-long fangs. His hair became wild and feral, and his whisker marks thickened. Eventually a red mist of chakra swirled around his body, before condensing. Everyone there froze at what happened next. A bubble of glowing red chakra popped out from under his feet. It started to get larger, enveloping Naruto's body in a bubbling, red, vaporous shroud of vile chakra. Soon, 2 protrusions formed on the back of his head. They vaguely resemble Kurama's long, wide, flat ears, but were distorted and were vaporous like the rest of the shroud. A small section at the base of his spine popped out, then began to elongate and writhe, twisting and retching itself into a form resembling a foggy, bubbling form of one foxtail. Kakashi could only watch and muttered quietly, That's the 9-tail shroud. Could the seal already be that weak? At the very least, it's only 1 tail, but I've got to stop it quickly." At Tezuna's house, Yuzume suddenly froze and collapsed to the ground with her arms wrapped around herself and she shivering violently. Hamura bent down to check on her and said, Yuzume, what's wrong?" With sheer terror in her voice she said, "I can feel it, so much hatred and rage." She then started to release slow tears, "And it's all coming from Naruto. I just wish I knew what was going on." Homura sighed and started to rub her back. He then looked at the bridge and thought, even without a bond I can feel the rage. What the hell is going on? Naruto glared at Ikiya with his fangs bared. In a burst of speed Naruto disappeared and reappeared in front of Ikiya. He grabbed her head tightly with his chakra-infused hand. Then Naruto ran while holding her head as tightly as possible. This resulted in Ikiya's body being thrown around like a rag doll. Naruto then slammed her head into the ground while running, the concrete cracking under the force. After a minute of running, Naruto threw her into the air. Everyone could see Ikiya's damaged face, and to say the least it had seen better days. He threw his arms behind him and smacked the tail against the ground, launching him towards the Sekirei in the air. Ikiya brought her hands up to guard, but Naruto just grabbed one as a red chakra arm extended out of his shroud and grabbed her face again. He then reeled the arm back and slammed her against the ground again. He then swung her the other way and back again over and over, finally slamming her against it and letting go. The fist of the arm increased to the size of a human torso and punched the ground repeatedly. After several blows, he smashed the ground one more time and sent Ikiya crashing through the bridge and slamming into the water below. Naruto threw his head back, curled up his arms and roared monstrously. But it wasn't simply a mindless bellow. It was a roar full of rage and agony. He stood there bellowing for several seconds before turning to face Akitsu. He walked forward clumsily and then dropped to his knees, his shroud starting to recede. He turned her over and put one hand under Akitsu's head and placed the other against her shoulder. He started to shake her gently, a weak smile across his face. "Come on, Akitsu, time to wake up." When she didn't respond, he tried again, with more pain in his voice. He tried over and over, his eyes filling with tears as each person seeing this could only watch in sadness as he fruitlessly tried to wake her up. He eventually resorted to just saying her name over and over as his tears streamed down his face, lapping against her pale skin. He shook her more vigorously. "Akitsu," he said weakly. "Akitsu again. Akitsu, Akitsu, Akitsu." He finally started crying in loud wails as he held her close to him. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 4. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author ZuttoAragi on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.